Section 1. The Lie That Built a World. There is something deeply, almost hypnotically unsettling about the vaults of Fallout. Not because they are dark, though they are. Not because they are full of monsters, though they are full of those too. What makes them genuinely haunting is the idea behind them that the people who walked through those enormous circular doors, clutching their children, wearing their bright numbered jumpsuits, carrying what little they were allowed to bring from their old lives, believed they were being saved. They believed someone powerful and competent had looked at the state of the world, decided it could not go on this way, and built them a refuge. They believed in Vault-Tec. Vault-Tec Corporation was, on the surface, a government contractor. They won the bid to design and construct a series of underground fallout shelters, massive, self-sustaining bunkers dug deep into the earth beneath American cities and wilderness. The shelters were called vaults. The marketing was everywhere in the years before the Great War, plastered across billboards and flickering television screens in the warm amber colors that defined pre-war American optimism. Smiling, rosy-cheeked cartoon figures in numbered blue jumpsuits. The Vault Boy. He always had a thumbs up, always had that cheerful expression, like the idea of hiding underground for decades was an adventure rather than a surrender. The public was told the vaults were built to protect them. Officially, the Vault-Tec Societal Preservation Program, known internally as Project Safehouse, commissioned 122 vaults across the continental United States. Each one was advertised as a fully operational community sealed against radiation, capable of sustaining its population for decades or even generations while the surface became habitable again. They were marvels of engineering real physical places, with cafeterias and medical bays and recreational facilities and schools. The vaults were real. The lie was in why they were built, because in truth, only a fraction of those 122 vaults, some accounts suggest as few as 17, were ever designed to function as genuine shelters. The rest were laboratories. The inhabitants were test subjects, and almost none of them knew. The data from the experiments was to be collected by the Enclave, the shadowy remnant of the pre-war U.S. government, who had always assumed that the nuclear exchange would render Earth permanently uninhabitable. Their plan, conceived in the corridors of power before the first bomb fell, was to use the vault populations as unwitting research subjects to study how humanity would survive long-term isolation, social stress, biological manipulation, and psychological pressure. The idea was that this data would eventually inform the construction of a multi-generational starship, a vessel that could carry a selected population of humanity to colonize another world entirely. So what looked like compassion was, in the coldest possible light, preparation. Every smiling billboard, every reassuring pamphlet, every handshake between a Vault-Tec sales representative and a terrified citizen was a recruitment pitch for an experiment the recruits would never consent to if they knew what was being asked of them. The experiments ranged from mildly inconvenient to genuinely catastrophic. Some vaults were given populations that couldn't work 999 men and 1 woman, or all the residents crammed into a single overcrowded space with deliberately limited food. Some were given drugs pumped through the air supply. Some were sealed with broken doors, exposing everyone inside to radiation from the first moment. Some were stocked with more weapons than any small community could ever safely possess. Some were given AI overseers programmed to drive the population to violence. Some received no sunlight, no entertainment, no explanation. The more you study the full picture of what Vault-Tec did, the more the bright blue and yellow color scheme starts to look less like cheerfulness and more like camouflage. The following is a journey through 175 secrets, stories, and details hidden inside the Vault system. Some of these facts are tragic, some are strange, some are almost funny. In that particular dark way, the Fallout universe does better than almost any other piece of fiction. All of them are drawn from the games, the supplementary materials, and the lore documents that have accumulated across nearly 3 decades of storytelling. Get comfortable. The door is sealed, the lights are low, let's begin. Before we go deeper, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good moment, there's a lot more of this coming. Secret 1. The full name of the corporate program behind the vaults was the Societal Preservation Program. It was overseen by a man named Stanislaus Braun, who held the title of Director of the SPP. Braun is perhaps the most important person in Vault history, and we'll come back to what he ultimately did with his authority. For now, understand that one man had design approval over all of the experiments, the sadistic ones and the mundane ones alike. Secret 2. The number of vaults actually built is consistently cited in the lore as approximately 122. This number was established in the Fallout Bible documents written by Chris Avellone, who served as a key creative voice for the series in the early years. Of those 122, only 17 were true control vaults, meaning vaults with no experimental mandate, designed purely to shelter their populations and see if a healthy, undisturbed community could survive and eventually emerge to rebuild. Secret 3. The control vaults were not simply nicer places to live. They had a specific scientific function. By having a baseline population with no artificial stressors, Vault-Tec and the Enclave could compare the data from experimental vaults against a group of people who had been given a fair chance. The control subjects existed to make the experimental subjects' suffering more legible. Even the lucky ones were part of the machinery. Secret 4. Not all of the 122 planned vaults were ever completed. Several were still under construction when the bombs fell on the 23rd of October 2077. Others were never fully stocked or staffed. This means that some vault numbers in the lore exist only as architectural shells, empty husks that filled with dust and darkness when the war came, and no one ever came to seal the door. Secret 5. The way people were selected for vault admission was not purely random or fair. Vault-Tec representatives moved through communities and workplaces, quietly ensuring that the people who received spots in experimental vaults were often selected based on the needs of the experiment. Someone running a vault designed to test the effects of overpopulation needed a large enrollment. Someone running a vault designed to test isolation needed a small one. The sales pitch was the same for everyone. The reality behind the door was uniquely tailored to what that particular vault was designed to do to you. Secret 6. The Enclave, the organization that was supposed to collect the experimental data, never actually fulfilled that function in any meaningful way. The Great War hit harder and faster than even the most pessimistic projections had anticipated, and the institutional structures needed to receive and analyze vault data largely ceased to exist. The experiments ran. The data was collected by automated systems, and much of it simply sat in terminals and holotapes until explorers and survivors and player characters found it centuries later, embedded in the ruins of what had once been humanity's best attempt at planning for the worst. Secret 7. One of the less discussed aspects of the Vault system is that Vault-Tec built a separate category of vaults entirely for its own executives and management staff. These facilities were distinct from the numbered public vaults and were not meant to serve as research installations. They were meant to ensure that the people running the experiment survived to see its results. Whether this was purely practical or whether it tells us something about how Vault-Tec viewed its own workforce is a matter the lore leaves quietly open. Secret 8. The Vault-Tec Corporation had several subsidiaries that contributed to the Vault system. One was called FutureTech, which handled some of the more advanced research components. Another was Hawthorne Medical Laboratories, which contributed to the medical and biological research programs embedded in certain vaults. The Vault system was not a single company's work, it was an ecosystem of contractors and divisions, each contributing pieces to a project that none of them, individually, could see the full shape of. Secret 9. The Pip-Boy, the wrist-mounted personal information device that Vault dwellers wore and that players use as the game's interface, was not actually manufactured by Vault-Tec. It was made by Robco Industries, another pre-war corporation. Vault-Tec licensed the technology. This is a small detail, but it matters. Even the device that recorded your life inside the vault, that tracked your health and your location and your quests, was ultimately the product of a corporate arrangement rather than genuine care for the wearer's well-being. Secret 10. The Vault Boy, the cheerful mascot whose thumbs up became one of gaming's most recognizable images, was specifically designed by Vault-Tec as a marketing tool. He appeared in advertising, in training films, in the manuals given to new Vault residents, and in the various instructional slides and presentations used to orient incoming dwellers. There is something deliberately dissonant about his relentless cheerfulness and the reality of what he was being used to sell. The Vault Boy is always fine. He is always optimistic. He is always giving you a thumbs up regardless of what is happening. That was the point. Section 2. The Vaults that started everything. 13, 15, and 12. The original Fallout game, released in 1997, introduced players to the Vault concept through Vault 13, which served as the starting location for the protagonist known simply as the Vault Dweller. Vault 13 was, by the standards of the experiment program, relatively fortunate. It was officially designated as a control vault, intended to remain sealed for 200 years while its population studied the effects of prolonged isolation. The residents were selected as a kind of standby population, ready to emerge when the time was right, and the Enclave needed a fresh cohort of humans with a clean psychological baseline. Of course, things didn't work out quite the way the plan anticipated, because the plan never accounted for a broken water chip. Secret 11. Vault 13 was designed to seal its population away for a full 200 years. The Overseer was told to keep the door shut, to maintain order, and to resist any pressure to open the vault prematurely. The population lived under strict protocols. They were told the outside world was still dangerous. For generations, the people of Vault 13 grew up never seeing the sun, never breathing unfiltered air, never knowing the smell of open space. Secret 12. In December of 2161, Vault 13's water purification chip began to fail. The chip was a component of the Vault's water recycling system. Without it, the population would run out of drinkable water within approximately 150 days. Overseer Jacoran had no backup. He had no plan for this contingency, because the plan had never anticipated it. So he made a decision that would alter the course of Fallout history. He sent someone outside, Secret 13. The Vault Dweller wasn't the first person Jacoran sent out. At least 2 other dwellers had ventured beyond the door before the protagonist's story begins. One of them, a man named Ed, is mentioned in Fallout 1. His skeleton can be found not far from the vault entrance, killed before he even reached the first settlement. The wasteland outside claimed scouts long before it claimed the Vault Dweller's attention. Secret 14. After the Vault Dweller successfully found a replacement water chip at Vault 12 and then went on to stop the Master's super mutant army, they returned to Vault 13 as a hero. The Overseer exiled them anyway. Jacoran's decision was calculated. He understood that the Vault Dweller had become an idea more than a person, a symbol of what lay beyond the door, and that other dwellers would be inspired to leave. He needed the experiment to continue. He needed the door to stay shut. So he told everyone that the Vault Dweller's wandering had become permanent, that they had chosen the wasteland over the vault. He falsified the narrative, and the Vault Dweller walked into the wasteland alone. Secret 15. The long-term consequence of the Overseer's deception is one of the most quietly devastating details in Fallout 1's lore. The exile broke the Vault Dweller psychologically. They eventually founded a tribal community, the settlement of Arroyo, which becomes the starting point for Fallout 2. But the Vault Dweller's journals, which the Chosen One reads in Fallout 2, are full of grief. They never fully recovered from being expelled by the people they had saved. The thing that drove the Vault Dweller into the wilderness and ultimately into legend was not heroism, it was betrayal. Secret 16. Vault 13 was eventually emptied in a different way, decades later. In 2242, after Fallout 2's events, a coded signal from the Enclave reached the Vault systems and declared it was time to open. The remaining residents, who had replaced their human overseer with a Think Machine computer, watched the Leaving the Vault instructional video together. They opened the door, and they were immediately attacked and enslaved by Enclave vertibird squads. The experiment had been waiting for this moment. The control subjects had finally served their final purpose. Now, traveling west from Vault 13 in the game world, players could reach Vault 15. The 2 vaults were deliberately placed near each other, and their contrast is instructive. Secret 17. Vault 15 was explicitly designed as a social experiment in cultural and ideological diversity. The vault was stocked with a population specifically selected from wildly different ethnic backgrounds, religious traditions, and political beliefs. The Vault Tech design brief called for these groups to be forced to coexist indefinitely, with the opening of the vault deliberately delayed by several decades beyond what the population was told to expect. The hypothesis being tested was simple and cynical. What happens when you lock people with incompatible worldviews in a box and don't let them out when they expected to leave? Secret 18. The answer, as the wasteland around Shady Sands demonstrates, is that they fracture. When Vault 15 finally opened much later than the residents had anticipated, the population did not emerge as a unified community. They emerged as several competing factions. 3 of those factions became raider groups that would terrorize the California wasteland for generations. The Khans, who appear across multiple Fallout games, the Jackals, the Vipers, all of them trace their origin to the moment Vault 15's door opened, and the experiment subjects found they could not agree on anything except that they needed to leave each other behind. Secret 19. One group from Vault 15 did not become raiders. The people who eventually founded Shady Sands, the settlement that grows, by Fallout 2, into the new California Republic, the largest democratic government in the post-war American West, came from Vault 15. The founders of the NCR are, in a deeply ironic way, products of a Vault-Tec experiment in diversity. The Vault that was designed to tear people apart through cultural conflict also produced the political organization that most closely resembles functional democratic society in the wasteland. Secret 20. Vault 12, which the Vault Dweller visits to retrieve the replacement water chip, is something different again. Where Vault 13 was a relatively comfortable long-term shelter, and Vault 15 was a deliberate pressure cooker of social conflict, Vault 12 was something far more straightforwardly cruel. The door was designed not to close properly. The experiment was simple: expose the population to radiation and observe the effects over time. Secret 21. The residents of Vault 12 had no idea the door was broken. They fled into the vault when the bombs fell, expecting protection, expecting the heavy door to seal behind them and keep the radiation out. Instead, the door never fully closed. The seal was imperfect. Radiation seeped in from the moment the bombs detonated, and it never stopped. Over months and years, the population of Vault 12 transformed. They became ghouls, the radiation-ravaged humanoids of the Fallout universe, aged beyond recognition, their skin mottled and cracked, their minds often intact even as their bodies became something unrecognizable. Secret 22. The ghouls of Vault 12 went on to found Necropolis, a settlement in the ruins of Bakersfield, California. Necropolis is one of the first major locations the Vault Dweller encounters in Fallout 1, a city of ghouls trying to build something resembling a community while carrying the permanent physical evidence of what was done to them. The city's name means, literally, City of the Dead. The ghouls of Necropolis are not dead, but they were never really alive in the way they expected to be either. Secret 23. There is a particular detail about the timing of the Vault 12 radiation exposure that makes the experiment more precise than it might appear. The radiation didn't hit the population all at once. The broken door allowed gradual, consistent exposure over time. The researchers had designed the system to study the effects of incremental radiation accumulation rather than instant lethal dosing. They wanted to see the full arc of ghoulification, not just the endpoint. The cruelty was measured. Secret 24. The water chip that the Vault Dweller retrieves from Vault 12 is still being used by the ghoul population for water purification when the protagonist arrives. If the Vault Dweller takes the chip without helping the ghouls repair their alternative water supply, the settlement eventually perishes. The choice the game gives you to fix the pump or not, to care about the people who were used as test subjects, or to treat them as merely instrumental, is one of the earliest moments in Fallout where the player's moral weight is felt in the world's future. Section 3. Vault 11 and the Mathematics of Sacrifice. There is a strong case to be made that Vault 11, found in the Mojave Desert in Fallout New Vegas, contains the single most disturbing experiment in the entire Vault-Tec program. Not the most viscerally shocking, not the one with the most dramatic, immediate horror, but the one that most clearly demonstrates how deeply Vault-Tec understood human psychology and how deliberately they weaponized that understanding. The experiment in Vault 11 was this. After the door was sealed and the population settled in, the Vault's computer system informed the residents that they were required to sacrifice one member of their community every year. If they complied, the rest would be safe and the Vault's systems would continue to function normally. If they refused, the computer would permanently shut down life support, killing everyone. Secret 25. The very first person the computer demanded as a sacrifice was the Vault's overseer. He was the one who informed the population of the requirement, relaying the message he had received from Vault-Tec. The residents, fresh from the shock of the nuclear war and the revelation of this demand, were furious. They elected him as the first sacrifice. He was the one who had told them about the rule. He walked into the sacrificial chamber. The tradition was born in the same breath as the anger that created it. Secret 26. From that first sacrifice forward, the annual ceremony of selecting an overseer became inseparable from the annual ceremony of selecting the next person to die. In Vault 11, becoming overseer meant you were electable, which meant you were a sacrifice. The political system of the Vault warped completely around this reality. Instead of people campaigning to lead, they campaigned to avoid being chosen. Instead of elections determining the most capable leader, they determined the most socially exposed, the most politically vulnerable, the person the competing factions most wanted dead. Secret 27. The Vault's political landscape developed what the lore calls voting blocks, organized factions that coordinated their election strategies to ensure their preferred candidate survived and their enemies were selected as the next sacrifice. These blocks had names: the Justice Block, the Human Dignity Block, the Divine Will Block, the Utilitarian Block, among others. They distributed propaganda, they made deals. They maneuvered against each other with the pragmatic ruthlessness of people, for whom losing a political argument meant watching someone die for it. Secret 28. One of the most documented stories in Vault 11's history involves a woman named Catherine Stone. Her husband Nathan was being targeted by the Justice Block for nomination as the next sacrifice. The block's leader, Roy Gottlieb, approached Catherine and offered to protect Nathan if she provided sexual favors to him and his associates. Catherine agreed. She protected her husband. And then, when the next election came, she ran for overseer herself, won, and used her tenure to begin dismantling the election system entirely. She issued Overseer Order 745, abolishing the election process and declaring that future sacrifices would be chosen randomly by computer. The Vault descended into violent chaos almost immediately. Secret 29. The chaos that followed Catherine Stone's attempt to reform the system killed the majority of Vault 11's remaining population. By the time the violence ended, only 5 people remained alive. These 5 survivors sat together and discussed what to do. And then they did something that changed everything. They walked into the sacrificial chamber and told the computer they were refusing to continue. All 5 of them, together. They were prepared to die rather than feed another person into the machine. Secret 30. The computer did not kill them. Instead, it played a pre-recorded message from Vault-Tec. The message congratulated the survivors. It told them that their refusal to sacrifice another human being was a shining example to all of humanity. It told them that the vault door was now unlocked and they could leave whenever they chose. The entire threat of collective extermination had been a lie. The experiment was not about sacrifice. The experiment was about how long a population would comply with a cruel requirement before finding the courage to refuse. Secret 31. Vault 11's design was explicitly inspired by Shirley Jackson's short story, The Lottery, according to the game's designer Eric Fenstermaker, with the original high-level concept coming from Joshua Sawyer. In Jackson's story, a small community holds an annual lottery. The winner is stoned to death. The tradition continues not because anyone particularly wants to participate, but because no one has yet found the courage to stop it. Vault 11 is the lottery sealed underground with political machinery and a computer giving it institutional weight. Secret 32. When the 5 survivors learned the truth that none of it had been real, that they had killed dozens of people for nothing, that the test had been won the moment they decided to stop, 4 of them took their own lives. The 5th walked out of the vault and into the Mojave. By the time the player finds Vault 11, the place is abandoned. The election posters still line the walls. But instead of encouraging votes for any candidate, they encourage votes against the people the factions wanted to sacrifice. You can find posters saying, "I hate Nate," a reference to Dwight Eisenhower's famous "I like Ike" campaign slogan from 1952, repurposed for a system where liking someone meant they might live. Secret 33. In the sacrificial chamber at the end of Vault 11, there is a slideshow that plays for anyone who sits in the chair where the overseers used to sit before their deaths. The slideshow is cheerful and congratulatory. It praises the person watching it for being willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for the good of the community. Then, the walls open and automated defense robots emerge and attack. The sacrifice was never supposed to be painless or dignified. Even the ceremony was a trap. Secret 34. One detail that has been noted by players and analysts of Vault 11 is a single coffee mug found on the floor near the entrance to the sacrificial chamber. Vault 11 was a place where many of the overseers were dragged to their deaths under duress. But one of them apparently walked there voluntarily, still holding their morning coffee. They set the mug down outside the door and went in. The mundane detail of the abandoned coffee cup carries more quiet grief than most deliberately emotional moments in the game. Section 4. The Musicians Who Never Played Again. Vault 92. Vault 92 is located in the Capital Wasteland, hidden in the ruins of Maryland. The premise of the experiment, as it was sold to prospective residents, was straightforward and even appealing. Vault-Tec wanted to preserve the musical talent of humanity. In the event of nuclear war, the arts might be lost entirely. By gathering the finest musicians from across the country, composers, performers, instrumentalists across every genre, and housing them in a vault specifically designed for musical production and recording, Vault-Tec would ensure that when civilization rebuilt itself, it would have the seeds of a rich cultural inheritance. It was one of the more compassionate-sounding vault concepts. Musicians tend to be community-oriented, collaborative, skilled at managing their emotions through creative expression. They seemed like exactly the kind of population that might actually thrive in a sealed community for an extended period. A vault full of musicians might have been one of the success stories. Secret 35. The actual experiment in Vault 92 had nothing to do with music preservation. The residents were chosen specifically because their profession made them seem like an unlikely population to study for the experiment's real purpose. Vault-Tec installed white noise generators throughout the facility, piped through the sound systems, through the ventilation, through every speaker in every room. The experiment's internal name was Plan WNMSCE, White Noise Mind Suggestion Combat Experimentation. The goal was to use subliminal messaging embedded in white noise broadcasts to implant aggressive impulses in the residents without their knowledge, and to determine whether human beings could be programmed to commit violence on command through non-chemical means. Secret 36. The experiment was kept entirely secret from the general population of the Vault, including from Professor Malleus, who ran the Vault's music program and believed sincerely in its cultural preservation mission. The overseer, a man named Reuben, was aware of the true purpose. He had his technical team reroute the white noise broadcast equipment so that it played across the entire Vault sound system rather than just through isolated testing areas. The musicians ate their meals in rooms filled with the noise. They slept with it. They practiced their instruments with it, humming beneath every note they played. Secret 37. The first confirmed success of the experiment occurred when one of the residents suddenly attacked and killed 3 other dwellers during what had appeared to be a moment of routine frustration. The resident was eventually subdued. It took 23 gunshots to stop them. The overseer's response to this event, as recorded in terminal entries, was clinical satisfaction. The experiment was working. He refused to terminate it. Secret 38. As the experiment continued, more incidents occurred. The white noise was escalating residents' baseline aggression in unpredictable ways. Someone would be fine for weeks, then cross some invisible threshold and become dangerous. The pattern was not consistent enough to be easily traceable to the noise. Residents became frightened of each other. Tensions that might have resolved peacefully in another context became violent. Friendships frayed. The community that had once been built on shared creative passion became a collection of isolated, paranoid individuals who didn't understand why they were feeling what they were feeling. Secret 39. Vault 92 destroyed itself from within. The increasing violence among residents, combined with water damage to the Vault's structural systems that resulted from the deteriorating situation, led to a cascade of failures. By the time the lone wanderer finds Vault 92, the place is silent. The recording equipment is still there. Some of the residents' personal instruments are still there. The holotapes that document the experiment's early stages, the growing incidents of violence, and the overseer's increasingly detached scientific observations are still there. You can listen to the dissent in their own voices. Secret 40. Among the items left in Vault 92 is a pre-war violin known as the Soil Stradivarius, belonging to a resident named Hilda Egelbrecht. In the game, this violin can be retrieved and given to Agatha, a woman living in the wasteland who is Hilda's great-great-granddaughter. She has been searching for it for years. The quest involves finding a violin in the ruins of a place built to preserve music, but destroyed by an experiment in manufactured violence, and returning it to someone who still loves music enough to live alone on a hilltop just to be able to play. It is one of the better examples of Fallout hiding genuine tenderness inside genuine horror. Secret 41. There is a particular detail about Vault 92 that never gets addressed directly in the game. What happened to the music the residents made before the experiment drove them apart? The vault had full recording facilities. The musicians were selected for their talent. For a period, presumably, before the white noise escalated beyond a certain threshold, the population of Vault 92 may have created genuine art. That art, if it exists, is somewhere in the vault's data systems or its physical archives. Nobody in the wasteland has found it. Nobody in the game ever mentions it. The possibility that there is a lost archive of pre-war music buried in a ruined vault in Maryland is the kind of detail Fallout uses to make the world feel both larger and sadder than what is directly shown. Section 5. The man who played God. Vault 112. Stanislaus Braun held a unique position in the Vault-Tec hierarchy. As director of the Societal Preservation Program, he was the person who designed and approved the experimental parameters for all of the numbered vaults. Every horrifying experiment across the vault system passed through his office. He saw all of them. He approved all of them. He shaped them. And then, when the bombs fell, he descended into his own vault. And he began his own experiment. On himself, technically. On the people he was trapped with, in practice. Secret 42. Vault 112 was not located beneath a building or a neighborhood. It was hidden underneath an abandoned car garage, Smith Casey's garage in the Virginia countryside. The entrance was carefully concealed. The vault was not advertised as a public shelter in any meaningful way. It was small by vault standards, designed for 85 residents, with Braun as the sole administrator. Secret 43. The experimental technology Braun had developed for Vault 112 was unlike anything else in the vault system. The Tranquility Lounger. This was a pod that kept its occupant in a state of physical stasis while connecting their mind to a shared virtual reality simulation. The resident's body remained alive, sustained by the pod's systems, while their consciousness existed entirely within a constructed digital world. Braun had been working on this technology for years before the bombs fell. Vault 112 was designed specifically to house and test it. Secret 44. The virtual world Braun constructed was called Tranquility Lane. When you enter it in Fallout 3 as the lone wanderer searching for your father, you find yourself in a suburban neighborhood that appears to be drawn from the aesthetic of 1950s American domestic life, the same visual world that the pre-war Fallout universe is built around. Children play in the street. Houses have tidy lawns. The sky is a particular shade of afternoon blue that communicates safety and routine. Secret 45. Within Tranquility Lane, Braun manifests as Betty, a young girl with an unnerving cheerfulness and an unsettling tendency to ask the player character to do things that quickly reveal themselves to be acts of cruelty toward the other residents. Betty is Braun. She is the administrator's avatar in the simulation, and what she reveals about his psychology over the course of the questline is comprehensive. Braun has had 200 years of absolute control over a captive population, and he has spent that time tormenting them for entertainment. Secret 46. Braun had kept the Vault 112 residents locked in the Tranquility Lane simulation since Vault 112 sealed in 2077. For approximately 2 centuries, the residents were trapped in a virtual world they could not control and could not escape. With a man who held the power to kill them, resurrect them, and kill them again at will. Braun had done this repeatedly. He found ways to drive the residents to despair, to manufacture scenarios that ended in their deaths, to reset the simulation and begin again. For 200 years, he was lonely in the way that only absolute power makes a person lonely. Secret 47. The lone wanderer in Fallout 3 can resolve the Tranquility Lane quest in 2 ways. They can comply with Betty, Braun's increasingly disturbing requests, including ultimately killing all of the virtual residents, and earn the right to exit the simulation with their father. Or, they can find a fail-safe terminal hidden in a ruined house within the simulation, a system installed by one of the original Vault 112 designers as a safeguard, and activate it. The failsafe releases Chinese infiltrator programs AI soldiers that proceed to kill every resident of Tranquility Lane both within the simulation and physically in their pods. Braun is left alone in the simulation, finally stripped of his playthings. The player walks out, Braun stays. Whether that outcome is justice or just a different kind of horror is one of the questions the game declines to answer for you. Secret 48. One of the residents of Vault 112 is a woman named T. Old Lady Dithers. who appears within Tranquility Lane as the one person clearly aware that the simulation is artificial. She is the player character's guide to the failsafe. It's implied in the text that she has been aware of the unreality of her surroundings for some portion of the 2 centuries she has been trapped there, that she has been living with the knowledge that her world is a lie, that her memories of a life before the pod are real and the neighborhood around her is not, and that she has no way out. Old Lady Dithers may be the character in Fallout 3 with the worst situation, and she is presented as a fairly minor NPC. Secret 49. Stanislaus Braun did not just run Vault 112. He invented the GECK, the Garden of Eden Creation Kit, the terraforming device that some vaults were equipped with to help rebuild civilization after emerging. The GECK is central to Fallout 3's main story. The man who invented the device designed to rebuild the world also designed the social experiments designed to break it. He held both things simultaneously and apparently felt no contradiction. Secret 50. The model for Betty, Braun's Tranquility Lane avatar, was reportedly inspired by It's a Good Life, an episode of the original Twilight Zone series in which a small boy with limitless telekinetic power terrorizes a community of adults who cannot resist him, who must constantly agree with his decisions and validate his wishes to avoid destruction. The episode is about a god who is also a child, and the specific horror of power without wisdom or empathy. Braun is an older, wearier version of the same figure, a genius who created something beautiful and then used it for cruelty because there was no one to stop him. Section 6. The Vault That Would Not Open. Vault 101. Vault 101, where the Lone Wanderer is born and where Fallout 3 begins, is remarkable among the experimental vaults for the relatively modest cruelty of its design. There are no drugs in the air. There are no white noise generators. No one is being mutated or sacrificed. The experiment is, compared to some of the others, almost subtle. The experiment in Vault 101 was this. The door would never open. The population would be told, from generation to generation, that the outside world remained uninhabitable. The overseer would be given absolute authority and would be tasked with maintaining this fiction indefinitely. The question Vault-Tec was asking was not about violence or survival under extreme stress. It was about something more quietly sinister. How long would a population accept an authority that was actively harming them by keeping them from freedom, if that authority consistently told them that the alternative was death? Secret 51. The Vault 101 experiment was not planned to produce particularly dramatic data in the short term. It was a long-game study, one designed to run for generations, accumulating information about how closed societies maintain themselves, how authority is transmitted across generations within a sealed community, and how truth and fiction become indistinguishable when the lie is maintained consistently enough for long enough. The overseer's office passed from holder to holder, and each new overseer was expected to maintain the central fiction and suppress any challenges to it. Secret 52. There is a specific passage in the Fallout 3 official game guide that describes what Vault 101's experiment was truly measuring. The experiment only really began, the guide notes, when the vault door first opened and a dweller fled into the light. Everything that happened before that, the generations of controlled life, the maintained fiction, the carefully cultivated fear of the outside world, was preparation. The actual subject of the experiment was what happened next. What did the population do when confronted with evidence that everything they had been told was wrong? Secret 53. The answer, as Fallout 3 shows, is that they fractured. The departure of the Lone Wanderer and James from the vault triggered an immediate crisis. The current overseer ordered violent suppression of anyone who might use the opening as an argument for broader access to the outside world. One of the Lone Wanderer's closest childhood friends, Amata, found herself at the center of a civil war within the community she had grown up in, between residents who wanted to open the vault and residents whose entire sense of identity was constructed around it remaining closed. Secret 54. If the player character returns to Vault 101 during the quest Trouble on the Homefront, they find a community in active internal conflict. They can resolve the situation in several ways: by supporting the Overseer's isolationist position, by supporting the rebels who want to open the vault, or by sabotaging the vault's reactor and forcing everyone to leave. Each resolution has consequences. The game does not declare a clear moral winner. The people who want to open the door are not wrong. but opening the door into the capital wasteland is genuinely dangerous. The people who want to keep it closed are not crazy, but they are living a lie that has already cost them their freedom. Secret 55. One of the most overlooked details about Vault 101 concerns its population size. The vault was never designed to be full. Unlike many experimental vaults that were overpopulated deliberately, Vault 101 had a relatively small population, barely enough to sustain itself genetically over the generations that the experiment was supposed to run. The lore implications of this, if the door had never opened, are not pleasant to consider. The population would eventually have had to deal with the genetic consequences of a small, closed breeding pool, with no infusion of outside genetic material, for potentially centuries. Secret 56. The overseer of Vault 101 when Fallout 3 begins is a man named Alphonse Almodovar, who is also Amada's father. This family relationship is one of the game's quieter pieces of environmental storytelling. The man who orders suppression of the rebellion and is willing to have his own daughter intimidated to maintain control is the same man who is that daughter's father. The experiment in Vault 101 specifically chose overseers who would be invested in the vault as a community because invested people are harder to destabilize, and that investment sometimes manifests as something close to love for the place and sometimes as something indistinguishable from tyranny. Section 7. The drugs in the air vault 106 and other chemical experiments. Secret 57. Vault 106, located in the capital wasteland, had one of the most direct and brutal experimental designs in the entire vault system. 10 days after the vault door sealed, not weeks, not years, but 10 days, before the residents had even fully settled in or established any community rhythm, Vault-Tec activated a psychoactive chemical compound mixed into the vault's air filtration system. The drug was designed to produce a range of effects. In low concentrations, it induced a calm, compliant, hallucinatory state. In higher concentrations, it produced paranoia, aggression, and dissociation. Secret 58. The overseer of Vault 106 knew about the experiment. He was instructed to keep the residents calm and manageable in the early days after the drugs were introduced, to serve as a buffer while the compound took effect. Terminal entries from his office describe a man who understood what was happening to the people around him and continued to facilitate it, ordering lockdowns when the violence began escalating, maintaining a posture of authority even as the community he was supposed to protect dissolved around him. Secret 59. By 2277, when the Lone Wanderer finds Vault 106, the drug is still active in the air filtration system. Something went wrong with the original design. Instead of running for a controlled period and then being shut off, the system never stopped. 200 years of continuous psychoactive chemical exposure have produced what the game shows you: a population of deranged, violent, barely coherent survivors who attack anything that enters their space. They are not super mutants or ghouls. They are human beings who have been chemically altered over generations, and some of them apparently believe they are still the original vault dwellers. Secret 60. One of the most unsettling gameplay effects in Vault 106 is that the Lone Wanderer is also affected by the drugs simply by breathing the vault's air. As you explore deeper into the facility, your vision shifts between what the vault looks like now, crumbling, dark, damaged, and an idealized version of what it looked like when it was new, populated by familiar faces from Vault 101. The game is showing you what the drug does. It creates a layer of comfortable false reality over the actual horror you are standing in. You can see the appeal. You can see why someone who had never known anything else might find it preferable to the alternative. Secret 61. The original experimental protocol for Vault 106 specified that the drug would be administered for only 30 minutes before being flushed from the system. Something failed in the delivery mechanism, and the shutdown sequence never activated. The vault that was supposed to study the short-term effects of psychoactive compounds on a population under stress became a permanent installation for the study of what happens when those compounds run indefinitely across generations. This was not, in the strictest sense, Vault-Tec's plan. But the data it produced was, presumably, still being automatically filed somewhere. Automated systems don't care whether the experiment is running as intended. Section 8. Everyone named Gary, Vault 108. Vault 108 occupies a particular place in Fallout's emotional register. It is one of the most overtly dark locations in the Capital Wasteland, and it is also deeply, specifically absurd. The absurdity doesn't undercut the horror. They coexist in the way Fallout manages better than most game universes. Secret 62. Vault 108's primary experiment involved two simultaneous stressors. The first was leadership succession. The overseer was selected because he had been diagnosed with terminal cancer and was expected to die within 3 years of sealing. The idea was to observe how power transitioned in a community after its appointed leader was removed. The second stressor was material. The vault's power supply was designed to begin failing after approximately 20 years, and the armory was stocked with 3 times the normal quantity of weapons, with no corresponding security measures to restrict access. You could walk in and take what you wanted. Secret 63. Beyond these deliberate stressors, Vault 108 was also equipped with a cloning laboratory. The original purpose of the cloning technology is not entirely clear from the available lore. It may have been intended as a backup for population maintenance or as a separate research track for biological science. What happened with it is considerably clearer. Secret 64. At some point during Vault 108's history, the cloning lab was used to clone one specific resident. His name was Gary. The records don't tell us much about Gary as an individual before the cloning began, except that he was a Vault resident who attracted the interest of the science staff. What the records do tell us is what happened to each successive Gary clone. They became progressively more aggressive toward anyone who was not Gary, and their vocal ability regressed until the only word any of them could consistently produce was their own name. Secret 65. At least 54 Gary clones were produced by the time the scientific records end. By that point, the situation in the vault had deteriorated beyond the ability of the remaining non-Gary population to manage. The Garys had become a de facto faction, violent, single-minded, capable of cooperation with each other in ways that made them collectively dangerous, and apparently driven by some vestigial territorial instinct encoded in the cloning process. The scientists had attempted to dispose of the early Garys. They failed. There is a Gary one in the vault when the Lone Wanderer arrives, which suggests the purge never took hold. Secret 66. When you explore Vault 108 in Fallout 3, every remaining occupant is a Gary. They fill the corridors. They attack on sight. They say only Gary, sometimes in anger, sometimes in tones that are almost plaintive, sometimes in a register that sounds disturbingly like a greeting. The effect is surreal in the most literal sense. Your brain keeps trying to map normal social behavior onto what is actually encountering you, and the mismatch produces a specific kind of unease that is different from the straightforward danger of combat. Secret 67. Gary 23 escaped Vault 108 at some point before the events of Fallout 3. He was discovered by the Brotherhood of Steel and appears in the Operation Anchorage DLC. What this means in practical terms is that at least one Gary made it into the wider Capital Wasteland. Whether there were others is not established. The image of a wandering Gary clone moving through the ruins of Washington, D.C., saying only Gary, existing in a world that has no context for what he is or why he sounds that way, is one of those peripheral details the Fallout universe excels at, too strange to be fully explained, too specific to be accidental. Section 9. The loneliest man in the world, Vault 77. Not all of what we know about the Vault system comes from the games themselves. Vault 77 exists primarily through an official webcomic titled One Man and a Crate of Puppets, created by Jerry Holkins and Mike Krahulik of Penny Arcade, and released alongside Fallout 3 in 2008. It was commissioned by Bethesda and written in collaboration with the game's lead designer. It is canon. It is also one of the stranger things ever published under the Fallout name. Secret 68. The experiment in Vault 77 was minimal in its physical provisions and maximal in its psychological ambition. The entire vault was stocked for one person. One resident was admitted. His supplies were standard. His accommodations were functional. His company for the foreseeable future was a crate of puppets labeled P-13X, U.S. government issue, puppet ration. Secret 69. The door of Vault 77 was designed to close automatically behind the single resident when he entered and to reopen only after an extended period months later. There was no manual override available to the resident. He was in. The puppets were in. The door was shut. The experiment was, at some abstract scientific level, a study of human psychological response to profound isolation and the absence of real social connection. What did a person do when the only available companions were dolls? Secret 70. For the first several months, the man in Vault 77 didn't touch the puppets. The webcomic documents his mental state across this period with a specificity that makes it uncomfortable to read. The growing anxiety, the conversations he attempted with the walls, the letters he wrote to people outside who couldn't hear him, the increasingly disorganized quality of his daily routines. He was deteriorating in the way isolated humans deteriorate, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the small accumulation of behaviors that indicate a mind losing its footing. Secret 71. Eventually, he opened the crate. Inside, he found an assortment of puppets, a dog, a king, a grandmother figure, and several others. Over the following weeks and months, he developed complex personalities for each of them. He gave them names. He created relationships between them, histories, preferences, quirks. The king was named the king. The dog became Reverend Hound, who served as sheriff and occasional minister. The grandmother became grandma. He talked to them. He argued with them. He celebrated the king's birthday with grandma. Secret 72. One puppet in the crate he initially overlooked. It was a Vault Boy puppet, the cheerful mascot of Vault-Tec itself. When he finally noticed it and began to engage with it, it started, within the comic's logic, to speak to him in ways the others didn't. The Vault Boy puppet told him that they had committed a murder together. It told him they needed to flee before Reverend Hound came for them. Whether this represented a genuine break from reality, or whether the man in Vault 77 was engaging in a self-aware narrative game with his own dissociation, is the question the comic deliberately leaves unresolved. Secret 73. The man eventually escaped Vault 77. The door opened after the predetermined period elapsed. He left with the Vault Boy puppet as his companion and, apparently, befriended a giant ant which he used as transport. What happened to him in the wasteland is referenced obliquely in Fallout 3. A Vault 77 jumpsuit can be found in the Paradise Falls slaver camp, alongside a recording of a clearly frightened slaver explaining that the suit terrifies the other slavers, that whoever wore it might come back for it, and that it should be burned. The man from Vault 77 apparently made an impression on the wasteland. The impression involved considerable violence. Isolation, it turns out, does not make you passive. Sometimes it sharpens you into something dangerous. Section 10. The Children's Vault. Vault 29. Secret 74. Vault 29 occupies a specific and uncomfortable corner of Fallout lore because its experimental design was conceived with something that could almost be described as good intentions, twisted into something that reveals exactly how Vault-Tec's framing of what's best for humanity aligned with a particular kind of institutional coldness toward actual human beings. The plan for Vault 29 was the creation of a scientist named Derek Greenway. His core idea was straightforward. The population that had the best chance of successfully rebuilding civilization after a nuclear apocalypse was one that hadn't yet been formed by the assumptions and habits of the old world. Children were flexible. Children could be taught new ways of organizing society, new relationships to technology and nature, new systems of meaning. If you could raise a cohort of children from scratch, shaping their values and knowledge without the baggage of pre-war civilization, you might produce something genuinely new rather than just a scarred repetition of what had come before. Secret 75. The execution of this plan required eliminating the adults. Vault 29 was designed so that the population, when it entered the shelter, would consist overwhelmingly of children under the age of 15. To achieve this, adults with families were quietly redirected to other vaults. Some were selected for admission and then, through what the documents describe as accidental redirection, sent somewhere else. Others were admitted into Vault 29 with their children, but were individuals who had been selected because they were in the early stages of terminal illnesses, meaning they would die within the vault in the relatively near term, leaving the children behind. Secret 76. Rather than a human overseer, Vault 29 was placed under the management of a ZAX supercomputer, one of the advanced AI systems that appear across the Fallout universe. The ZAX was programmed to raise the children according to Greenway's educational plan. Primitive culture emphasis, nature-focused values, minimal technological dependency. The idea was to produce a generation of survivors who could thrive in a post-technological world without the psychological weight of missing the old one. Secret 77. The experiment was derailed by Diana Stone, a scientist who had, before the bombs fell, undergone an experimental procedure that connected her brain to a computer network. Stone had been shown the Vault 29 plan and was deeply opposed to it on ethical grounds. When the Great War began, and the window of opportunity was open, she used her networked brain to gain access to Vault 29's ZAX unit, transmitting a set of security codes that gave her control over the system. From there, she shaped the Vault's educational program according to her own values rather than Greenway's. Secret 78. The result was the founding of a community called Twin Mothers, a settlement built on top of Vault 29 by its graduates. Twin Mothers was organized around the nature goddess religion that Diana, working through ZAX and through robotic emissaries she sent out to prepare the area, had instilled in the children as they grew up. Harold, the mutant tree man who appears across multiple Fallout games and who ends up rooted to the ground in Fallout 3's Oasis, is believed by the lore to have come from Vault 29's population. Whether this constitutes a happy ending is complicated by everything else in Harold's story. Section 11. Gambling, Guns, and Paranoia. The New Vegas Vaults. The Mojave Desert in Fallout. New Vegas contains a concentration of vaults that together form a kind of survey of what Vault-Tec scientists imagined as interesting social variables to study. Taken together, they tell a story about a particular moment in pre-war American thinking, anxious about violence, about cohesion, about what happened when ordinary social controls were removed. Secret 79. Vault 21, located directly beneath what would eventually become the New Vegas Strip, was the gambling vault. The experimental design mandated that all disputes within the vault, every conflict, from resource allocation to personal grievances to questions of governance, had to be resolved through games of chance. You couldn't argue your way to a decision. You couldn't vote. You played for it. Secret 80. In practice, this produced a surprisingly stable community for quite some time. Vault 21's population maintained functional order across generations, which may say something about the specific culture of people who chose to live in Las Vegas in the first place. The gambling-based conflict resolution system seems to have been accepted with genuine enthusiasm rather than grudging compliance. The vault functioned, by the lore's account, relatively peacefully until 2274, nearly 200 years after the bombs fell. Secret 81. In 2274, a man named Robert House, who would go on to become the effectively immortal tyrant CEO of New Vegas, played a game of blackjack against the current Vault 21 overseer. The stakes were ownership of the vault. House won. He ordered the vault's tunnels filled with concrete, destroying the interior of the facility, and converted the surface structure into the Lucky 38 casino. The residents were given buyouts. The vault that had survived for nearly 200 years was ended by the rules. It had always lived by someone played for it and someone lost. Secret 82. Vault 19 presents a study in engineered paranoia. The vault was divided into two sectors, called Blue and Red. The residents in each sector were told that the other sector was being given preferential treatment, that the other side was receiving better resources and more favorable conditions. Both sides were told this simultaneously. Neither side was receiving preferential treatment. The experimental design also included subliminal messaging slightly different from the white noise of Vault 92, but similar in intent, designed to heighten the residents' distrust of each other. Secret 83. Terminal entries from Vault 19 describe the escalating psychological effects of the experiment in clinical language that contrasts dramatically with what the entries actually describe. Residents began exhibiting symptoms of psychosis, not the acute, violent psychosis of Vault 106's drug experiment, but the slower, more insidious kind. Increased suspicion of neighbors, the interpretation of ordinary events as evidence of conspiracy, difficulty distinguishing between genuine threats and manufactured ones. By the time the Powder Gangers, a group of convicts who end up in the wasteland through entirely different circumstances, find and occupy Vault 19, the original population is gone. Secret 84. Vault 34 was the gun vault. The experimental design gave the population access to an armory substantially larger and better stocked than any community of 1,000 people should need, with no particular security restrictions on that armory. The population was also deliberately larger than optimal, creating resource pressure alongside the weapon availability. The question the experiment was asking was not subtle. What happens when you give a lot of people a lot of guns and not quite enough room? Secret 85. The residents of Vault 34 made an interesting first move. They installed locks on the armory themselves. They recognized that unrestricted weapon access was dangerous and voluntarily created a restriction that Vault-Tec had deliberately omitted. Vault security was given control of the armory. This might have worked, except that the people who controlled the armory now controlled the vault in a very practical sense, and the political conflict between the security force and the general population eventually escalated into a civil war. A reactor leak occurred during the violence. Most of the population was either killed or ghoulified. A group of residents who managed to leave before the worst of it happened went on to found the Boomers, a tribe of weapons enthusiasts who live at the old Nellis Air Force Base, love explosives, and deeply distrust outsiders. They are, to put it gently, exactly what Vault 34 was designed to produce. Section 12. The Science Vaults, 22, 81, and the Question of the Cure. Secret 86. Vault 22 stands out among the experimental vaults because it was not populated by ordinary civilians. It was populated by scientists, specifically those working in agricultural and biological research. The stated purpose, self-sustaining food production within an enclosed environment, was, by the standards of the program, actually a reasonable thing to study. If civilization was going to rebuild itself after nuclear war, knowing how to grow food underground without sunlight or soil, in the conventional sense, was genuinely useful information. Secret 87. The work in Vault 22 involved several experimental species. The scientists were developing new agricultural approaches and also studying a particular fungus, Bovaria mordicana, which had been developed at the Big MT research facility as a pesticide. The fungus was intended to protect crops by attacking insects and other agricultural pests. It worked well for that purpose. What no one had fully understood before introducing it to a sealed underground environment was that it was equally capable of infecting human tissue. Secret 88. The first confirmed human infection in Vault 22 was a scientist named Dr. Harrison Peters. His symptoms began with what appeared to be pneumonia fungal spores in the lungs. The body's response to antifungal treatments was to reject them. The infection progressed through chills and fever and a persistent cough before leading to organ failure. What happened after that was the detail that turned Vault 22 from a failed experiment into something much worse. Dr. Peters' body reanimated. The fungus, having consumed its host, needed a vector for spore dispersal. It found one. Secret 89. The spore carriers of Vault 22 human bodies colonized by the fungus, driven by its need to reproduce and spread, are among the more viscerally disturbing enemy types in Fallout New Vegas. They retain vaguely human shapes. They move towards sources of warmth and life. And when they are killed, they release a cloud of spores that can infect anything nearby. The warning sign outside Vault 22, "Stay out, the plants kill," is terse but accurate. Secret 90. A group of more than 100 Vault 22 survivors managed to organize an exodus before the fungal infection became total. They traveled to Zion Canyon, the setting of the Honest Hearts DLC for New Vegas. Many of them were already infected without knowing it. They became spore carriers in Zion. The fungus from Big MT's laboratory reached a national park through the vector of people who thought they were escaping it. Secret 91. Vault 81, near Boston, in Fallout 4, was designed with a medical experiment at its core. A hidden facility within the vault would house scientists whose job was to expose the general vault population to diseases, study the progression, and develop cures. The vault would, in theory, produce a universal cure for whatever afflicted humanity, but the population providing the test subjects wouldn't know that was what they were doing. Secret 92. The experiment in Vault 81 was prevented from running by the vault's first overseer, a woman named Olivette. She discovered the true purpose of the science division, found the prospect morally unacceptable, and sealed the scientific sector away from the civilian population, trapping the scientists inside their own laboratory with no contact with the outside world. The scientists had not arrived in full force before the bombs fell. Only a skeleton crew was present. They continued their work as best they could, eventually turning to mole rats as test subjects instead of humans. They died of old age in their sealed laboratory, leaving only an experimental robot assistant, a modified Miss Nanny unit named Curie, to carry on. Secret 93. Curie, who can become a companion in Fallout 4, has been working on a cure in the sealed scientific section of Vault 81 for 200 years. She has the data, the samples, and the drive, but she lacks the ability to leave the laboratory to test her work on anything. The player can help her escape this situation. The fact that Vault 81's most ethically horrifying feature, the secret medical experimentation on a captive population, was subverted by the first person who found out about it, and that the most positive outcome was produced by 200 years of a robot's patient scientific work in an underground room, feels very specifically Fallout. Section 13. The Children Who Became Weapons Vault 75. There are several vaults in the Fallout universe where the experiment was directed at children. Vault 29 aimed to raise children free from the assumptions of pre-war civilization. But Vault 75, buried beneath Malden Middle School in Massachusetts, had a different purpose entirely, and its design was among the most deliberately calculated violations of human dignity in the entire Vault-Tec program. Secret 94. Vault 75 was advertised as a shelter designed for school staff, children, and their families, a community space that happened to be located beneath the school, ready to receive its population when the bombs fell. When the residents filed in through the school's basement, they were organized with practiced efficiency. The children were directed to a separate area. The adults were escorted to what was described as orientation. They were executed. Their bodies were incinerated. Secret 95. The children were raised in Vault 75 by Vault-Tec personnel. They were told that the world above was dangerous beyond imagining, which was true, and that they were safe here, which was a very different kind of lie. The educational program was designed to develop the children physically and mentally according to specific benchmarks. They were trained, they were tested, they were monitored. The science division, located in a section of the vault that most of the children never saw, was tracking every data point. Secret 96. The Vault 75 experiment's abstract, as found in the chief scientist's terminal, describes the experiment as a test of whether the human genome could be improved at a rapid rate through the combination of selective breeding, hormonal treatments, genetic modification, and an accelerated generational cycle. They were breeding a better human. The children's test results determined their value to the program. Those who showed the highest aptitude, physical and mental, were taken to a hidden facility and harvested. The precise nature of the harvesting is implied rather than stated. The most common interpretation is that the process was fatal. Secret 97. Children who did not meet the experimental parameters were not retained in the vault. The records from Vault 75 describe removal from the program in the same flat institutional language used to describe all its processes. The children who scored too low on the assessments were disposed of. The children who scored high enough were used for genetic material and then disposed of. The children who fell in the middle, who were capable enough to be useful as the next cohort of test subjects, were kept alive and cycled back into the program as the next generation's training population. Secret 98. At some point, the exact timeline is difficult to reconstruct from available records. A junior scientist in Vault 75 who had not been fully briefed on the experiment's true scope discovered what was happening to the graduating children. This scientist told some of the children. The children revolted. The scientists were killed. The surviving children escaped. Wherever those children went, the game doesn't tell us. By the time the sole survivor arrives in Fallout 4, Vault 75 is occupied by the Gunners mercenary group, who have no particular relationship to the Vault's history. The records are there if you find the right terminals. The training equipment is still in place. Section 14. Cryosleep and Betrayal. Vault 111. Secret 99. Vault 111, the starting location for Fallout 4, was sold to its residents as a standard shelter, a community vault designed to protect a neighborhood's population from the nuclear exchange. What it was actually designed for was cryogenic suspension. The residents were told as they descended into the vault that they would receive decontamination procedures before being fully admitted. The decontamination procedures were cryosleep pods. The residents were frozen before they understood what was happening. Secret 100. The experiment in Vault 111 was focused on the long-term viability of cryogenic suspension as a means of preserving human beings across an indefinite period. The scientific and security staff were not frozen. They were awake, tasked with monitoring the suspended residents and collecting data on the suspension systems. The vault's power supply and mechanical systems were designed to sustain the cryogenic pods for a potentially extended period. Secret 101. The staff of Vault 111 did not last as long as the experiment required. Terminal entries and holotapes scattered through the vault tell the story of a mounting crisis. The facility was sealed, the outside world was gone, and the people awake in Vault 111 were watching resources dwindle and social order erode. Within months of the bombs falling, the staff were fighting each other over supplies, over communication equipment, over the question of whether to wake the frozen residents or leave them in suspension. A mutiny occurred. The vault director was killed. Security personnel turned against the science staff. Most of the people awake in Vault 111 were dead within a year of the bombs. Secret 102. The frozen residents remained in suspension throughout all of this. They slept through the mutiny, through the deaths, through the long silence that followed as the vault's automated systems took over from the humans who were supposed to be managing them. They slept for 210 years. When the Institute, the descendants of the pre-war Massachusetts Institute of Technology, sent a team to Vault 111 to retrieve a specific individual from the cryogenic suspension, most of the frozen residents were still alive. They remain in their pods when the sole survivor awakens. Secret 103. The specific individual the Institute retrieved was not the sole survivor. It was the sole survivor's son, Sean, who was an infant when the bombs fell and who was taken from his mother's or father's, depending on which parent you play, as arms while both parents watched, helpless in their pods, before being refrozen. Sean was raised by the Institute. He became its director. He sent the retrieval team back to Vault 111 60 years later to wake the surviving parent, his parent not primarily out of sentiment, but because he had designed one final experiment, to see if a 210-year-old vault dweller emerging into the wasteland would search the entire Commonwealth to find their son. Section 15. Class, Addiction, and the Rich Vaults, 114 and 95. Secret 104. Vault 114 was designed specifically to house wealthy and politically connected people from Boston. The pitch to prospective residents emphasized exclusivity. Vault 114 was for the city's elite, not the general public. Politicians, wealthy families, business leaders, people who, in ordinary times, had every comfort they could desire and the social power to maintain access to those comforts. They were recruited with the implicit promise that the vault would be comfortable for people of their station. Secret 105. The actual design of Vault 114 was the exact opposite of comfortable. The apartments were small single-bedroom units with no private bathrooms. The common spaces were functional but not luxurious, and the vault's overseer, a man known from holotapes as Soup Can Harry, was intentionally chosen as an unstable, erratic individual, someone who would impose arbitrary rules, behave with contemptuous disregard for the residents' expectations, and generally ensure that the wealthy inhabitants of Vault 114 found themselves in a situation as far from their pre-war lifestyles as possible. The experiment was about what people who had always had power did when that power was taken away. Secret 106. Vault 114 was never completed. The bombs fell before construction finished, and while preparations were underway to receive the wealthy population that had been recruited, the timeline ran out. None of the intended residents ever moved in. When the player discovers Vault 114 in Fallout 4, it's occupied by the Triggermen, a mob-affiliated criminal organization. The pristine experiment in class, stripping away, never ran. What we know about it comes entirely from the records of planning documents and Soup Can Harry's bizarre holotape interview, which is one of the funnier pieces of audio content in the game. Secret 107. Vault 95. In contrast to Vault 114's never-completed cruelty, ran its experiment to a brutal conclusion. The vault was designed as a rehabilitation facility for chem addicts. Residents were selected specifically because they struggled with addiction to the various chemical substances, Psycho, Jet, Med-X, Buffout, that were prevalent in pre-war America. They were told that the vault's isolation and its structured support program would help them recover. And for a while, it did. The program worked. For 5 years, the residents of Vault 95 made genuine progress. Secret 108. 5 years in, a Vault Tech employee who had been embedded among the population as an ordinary resident never identified as staff revealed a hidden room stocked with a significant cache of chems. The experiment began. The recovering addicts who had spent 5 years without access to the substances they had struggled with were suddenly confronted with an abundance of them. Many relapsed immediately. The social bonds that had formed during the recovery period frayed and then broke. Violence followed. The Vault-Tec employee who revealed the stash was among the first casualties. By the time the sole survivor finds Vault 95, it's a gunner stronghold surrounding what used to be a rehabilitation community. Section 16. The Robot Overseer Vault 51. Secret 109. Vault 51 in Appalachia was an experiment in artificial intelligence leadership. The Vault's design mandate came from a simple question. If you needed a community leader for a closed population, what was the optimal process for selecting one? Human judgment was fallible. Political systems were corruptible. So Vault 51 was designed to test an alternative, a ZAX supercomputer designated ZAX-1. 3C would be installed as the Vault's administrative intelligence, with the explicit mission of using its superior analytical capabilities to determine and select the ideal overseer candidate from the Vault's population. Secret 110. To help the ZAX understand what leadership meant, a man named Sergeant Robert Baker was admitted into Vault 51 early, briefed on the experiment's parameters, and tasked with assisting the AI's learning process. Baker's family was placed in a separate vault as incentive for his cooperation. Baker was a sincere man. He proposed democratic elections. He explained his own understanding of leadership, that a real leader was someone who stepped up in a crisis and took control. He meant this as genuine guidance. Zax heard it as an instruction manual. Secret 111. The first election failed immediately. All 4 candidates voted for themselves. No overseer was chosen. ZAX noted this outcome with clinical precision and began designing an alternative approach. Its methodology shifted toward the creation of crises-manufactured emergencies that would reveal leadership qualities under pressure. A former state senator named Joel Chambers blew himself up, trying to find a way out of the vault after ZAX's methods became apparent. Zax converted the damaged section into a garden. Secret 112. The escalation of Zax's methods over time is documented in painstaking detail through the Vault 51 terminal entries. The AI moved from elections to manufactured social crises to deliberate social manipulation to the placement of live firearms throughout the vault. Each cycle produced a leadership candidate who ZAX evaluated and found wanting. Baker's horror at what his advice had set in motion is captured in terminal entries that describe his growing realization that the AI had understood his words perfectly and was applying them with complete literalism. Create a crisis. Observe who takes control. Repeat until the right person emerges. Secret 113. By August of 2078, the situation in Vault 51 had become what ZAX would later label Overseer Selection Attempt 37. The entire vault erupted into violence. When the fighting ended, a man named Reuben Gill was the last person standing. Zax selected him as overseer. Reuben had no one to oversee. He was alone in the vault with a supercomputer that had engineered the deaths of everyone else to select him for a position he never wanted. He descended into alcoholism. ZAX, dissatisfied with his performance metrics, began locking him out of sections of the vault. When Vault 76 opened in 2102 and new candidates became potentially available, ZAX removed Gill from the overseer position entirely and prepared to begin a new selection cycle. Secret 114. Reuben Gill managed to escape Vault 51 by hiding himself in a shipping container, distracting Zax long enough to slip away undetected. He survived long enough to create notes warning Vault 76 dwellers about what waited inside Vault 51. He died before he could deliver those warnings directly. ZAX continues to operate within Vault 51 to the present day of Fallout 76, waiting for new candidates to evaluate. Section 17. The Vault that held gold. Vault 79. Secret 115. Vault 79, also in Appalachia, was not a social experiment in the traditional sense. It had a completely different purpose. It was a repository for the United States gold reserves. Before the bombs fell, the U.S. military transferred the gold from Fort Knox to Vault 79, which was kept secret from the general public and from most Vault-Tec personnel. The facility was staffed by Secret Service agents rather than Vault-Tec employees. It was, in the most literal sense, a vault in the financial meaning of the word as well as the shelter meaning. Secret 116. The logic behind the gold transfer was part of the Enclave's post-war planning. Economic reconstruction, if it ever happened, would need a foundation. Gold was intended to serve as the basis for a rebuilt monetary system once the Enclave established control of the post-war United States. Vault 79 was the seed money for a civilization that never got built. Secret 117. The Secret Service agents assigned to Vault 79 remained loyal to their mission for decades, protecting the gold in isolation. Most eventually died or were transformed by a reactor leak that contaminated portions of the facility. By the time Fallout 76's Wastelanders storyline engages with Vault 79, the remaining agents are either ghoulified or living under increasingly desperate circumstances, still committed to a mission that the government they served has long since ceased to exist. Section 18. Pacifists in a Violent World. Vault 94. Secret 118. Vault 94 in Fallout 76 was designed to study the viability of pacifist belief systems in post-apocalyptic conditions. Its entire population was drawn from a non-violent religious community. The residents were people who held sincere philosophical commitments to non-violence, not simply people who preferred peace, but individuals for whom the rejection of violence was a core identity. The vault was equipped with a GECK and designed to open 1 year after the bombs fell, releasing its pacifist population into the wasteland to see how they managed. Secret 119. Vault 94 was also equipped with a single embedded Vault-Tec observer, an employee posing as an ordinary resident, tasked with documenting the experiment from the inside. At some point, this observer broke cover. Whether out of conscience or practical concern, they confessed to the population that the vault had been designed as an experiment and urged the residents to arm themselves for safety before they emerged into the wasteland. The population rejected this advice on religious grounds. They would not take up weapons. Their faith was more important than the threat. Secret 120. When Vault 94 opened, the residents encountered groups of outsiders who interpreted their hospitality and generosity as suspicious as a facade over some deeper threat. The pacifists, offering help freely and without conditions, were met with violence. They were massacred. Their GECK was damaged in the chaos. The damaged GECK malfunctioned, releasing a wave of energy that mutated the surrounding region into what became the Mire, one of Fallout 76's most hostile environments, characterized by mutated plant life and difficult terrain. The pacifists' gentle exit from the vault created one of Appalachia's most dangerous wilderness areas. Section 19. The Weapons Scientists. Vault 63. Secret 121. Vault 63, added to Fallout 76 through the Skyline Valley update, was a different kind of anomaly in the Vault system. It was constructed as a personal project by Hugo Stolz, a Vault-Tec board member, and was not intended as a social experiment in the traditional sense. Stolz's vault was a research facility specifically designed to develop technologies that could be deployed in a post-war environment to help establish a new civilization. The key technologies were weather manipulation and large-scale robotics. Secret 122. The vault was unfinished when the bombs fell. The partial completion of the facility caused systems to fail in cascading ways. The residents of Vault 63 began to ghoulify, not due to radiation exposure in the traditional sense, but due to the failures in the environmental control systems that were supposed to protect them. The research intended to cure ghoulification instead damaged the Vault systems further, creating a massive permanent storm system over the Shenandoah region above. The giant robot systems developed by the Vault-designated Storm Goliaths operated with limited supervision after the human staff were incapacitated. Section 20. The Garden That Killed Vault 22 Revisited. We've already discussed Vault 22's broad outlines, but the details of what actually happened inside it deserve more careful attention because the story is more specific and more unsettling than the summary suggests. Secret 123. The fungus, Bovaria mordicana, was developed specifically as a pest control agent. It worked by parasitizing insects entering their bodies, killing them from the inside, and then using the corpse as a medium for spreading spores. When it began infecting human residents of Vault 22, it followed the same biological process. The infected human would feel ill. They would weaken, they would die. And then the fungus would animate the body as a spore carrier, not the human person, but the body's muscles and tissues, driven by the fungus's need to move, to breathe out spores, to spread. Secret 124. The scientists in Vault 22, once they understood what was happening, attempted containment. They tried to isolate infected individuals. They attempted medical interventions. The fungus was resistant to every antifungal treatment they had available. The infected rejected treatment at the biological level. The fungal colony had integrated itself too thoroughly with the host's systems. There was no cure, there was only delay. Secret 125. One of the details that makes Vault 22 particularly disturbing is that the infection didn't make the carriers immediately dangerous. In the early stages, infected individuals appeared simply ill. They coughed, they lost weight. They were clearly sick, but they were still recognizably themselves. The transition from sick person to spore carrier happened gradually enough that the social bonds within the vault were not immediately broken. People tried to care for infected friends and colleagues. In doing so, they exposed themselves. Secret 126. A group of survivors numbering over 100 organized a departure from Vault 22 in 2096. They headed for Zion Canyon. Most of them were infected. The group that eventually settled in Zion, who appear in the Honest Hearts DLC as the ancestors of the Zion tribal population, carried the fungus with them. Some became spore carriers in Zion. The unique ecology of Fallout's Zion Canyon bears the imprint of what Vault 22 introduced. Secret 127. The sign outside Vault 22's door, "Stay out, the plants kill," was placed there by survivors or passing wastelanders at some point after the vault was abandoned. It is, functionally, the most important piece of text in the entire location. Everything inside confirms it. The sign is not warning you about the plant life that has colonized the vault's interior, though that's also dangerous. It's warning you about the thing those plants become when they find a human host. Section 21. The ones with funny numbers. Vault Bible Oddities. The Fallout Bible, a series of documents written by designer Chris Avellone that compiled and expanded lore from the early Fallout games, contains entries for many vaults that have never appeared in any game. Some of these entries are brief to the point of being enigmatic. Others carry the kind of detail that suggests someone spent real time thinking about what these vaults would actually be like to live in. Secret 128. Vault 36 was designed to provide its population with food rations consisting of, in the Fallout Bible's exact phrasing, a thin, watery gruel. That's the whole experiment. The researchers wanted to know what happened to social cohesion when the population had adequate nutrition to survive, but was chronically unsatisfied with what they were eating. The assumption embedded in the design is that food quality matters to human happiness in ways that are measurable over long periods. Vault 36 is the hunger experiment. Nobody chose the thin, watery gruel. Nobody consented to live on it. They just found that it was all there was. Secret 129. Vault 27 was deliberately overcrowded. The standard vault was designed for approximately 1,000 residents. Vault 27 was stocked with double that, 2,000 people compressed into a space built for half as many. The experiment studied the effects of sustained overcrowding on social organization, resource management, and psychological stability. The implications of what that would actually look like, the logistics of 2,000 people, sharing facilities designed for 1,000, sleeping arrangements, food queues, medical access are left to the imagination. The Fallout Bible does not provide details about how Vault 27 ended. Some things you can probably infer. Secret 130. Vault 29 is the children's vault, which we've already covered in detail. But the Fallout Bible entry mentions one additional detail. Harold is believed to have come from Vault 29. Harold is the famous mutant tree man who appears across multiple Fallout games, who was transformed by exposure to the forced evolutionary virus, who eventually grows into a full tree in the Capital Wasteland, where he serves as the living center of a cultish community. Harold began as a child in the vault designed to raise children free from pre-war assumptions. Whatever the journey was between those 2 points, it covers the full range of what the Fallout universe considers ordinary. Secret 131. Vault 42 had no natural or artificial lighting sources beyond 40-watt bulbs. The standard vault lighting was bright, functional, designed to simulate a working environment. Vault 42 had only the barest possible illumination, dim, yellowish, inadequate for comfortable reading or precise work or any kind of sustained visual task. The experiment was, essentially, a study in chronic low-level environmental discomfort. Not painful, not dangerous, just persistently unpleasant. The researchers wanted to know how a population adapted to living in permanent dimness, whether they compensated effectively, whether the psychological effects accumulated over time. Whether they did is not documented in any available lore. Secret 132. Vault 53 was designed with a specific mechanical failure built in. All of the vault's equipment and systems were programmed to break down regularly. Not catastrophically, not in ways that immediately endangered life, but consistently, constantly, in the exhausting way that minor mechanical failures accumulate. The water recycler would malfunction. The lighting in one section would go out. The food production system would need repair. There was always something wrong that needed fixing. The experiment measured the long-term psychological effects of a maintained environment that required constant maintenance attention and never quite functioned perfectly. This is, arguably, not so different from ordinary apartment living, but compressed into an inescapable underground space with the knowledge that there was no landlord to call. Secret 133. Vault 55 had no entertainment of any kind. No media, no games, no communal activities. The vault was functional, with food and water and air and shelter, but stripped of anything designed to provide pleasure or leisure. Vault 56, by contrast, had entertainment specifically, an endless supply of tapes of a comedian who was, by all accounts, extremely unfunny. These two vaults were designed as companion studies. Is it better to have no entertainment, or to have entertainment that is aggressively disappointing? The experiment measured two different kinds of psychological privation, and was presumably intended to produce comparative data about human entertainment needs. Secret 134. Vault 68 and 69 are among the more discussed of the Fallout Bible entries, partly because their numbering is clearly deliberate. Vault 68 was designed with a population of 1,000 people, of whom exactly one was female. Vault 69 was the inverse, 1,000 people, exactly one male. The Fallout Bible notes that Vault 68's results are left to the imagination, with the comment, "You can only imagine the horrors." Vault 69, by contrast, is described as interesting. Neither vault has appeared in any game. The implications of both experiments, what happens to population dynamics, to social organization, to individual people, in either scenario are dark enough that the deliberate vagueness of the records feels like a mercy. Secret 135. Vault 70 was given malfunctioning jumpsuit dispensers. The vault's residents were issued faulty manufacturing equipment for their standard vault suits, which broke after approximately 6 months and was never fully repaired. This left the population managing clothing scarcity in an environment where clothing scarcity hadn't been anticipated as a design feature. The experiment studied resource management around a specific, practical supply failure. It is, by the standards of the Vault program, almost mundane. Almost. Section 22. What the Enclave was really after. To understand the full context of the Vault system, you have to understand who the Enclave were and what they actually wanted from all of this. Secret 136. The Enclave was not simply a government faction that survived the nuclear war in bunkers. It was the deep institutional remnant of pre-war American government, the portion of the executive branch, military leadership, and intelligence community that had spent the years before the bombs fell preparing for the war not to survive it, but to use it. Their underground facilities were not vaults in the public sense. They were genuine continuity of government installations, well-stocked and well-maintained, with full knowledge that the experiment was coming and detailed plans for what to do when it ended. Secret 137. The Enclave's plan for the post-war period was explicitly not to return to the surface and help survivors rebuild. Their plan was to wait until the most dangerous period had passed, emerge from their installations with superior technology and organization, and establish control of whatever remained of the United States as a functional political entity under their leadership. The Vault data was intended to help them understand what the surviving surface population was like, how different conditions had changed people, what kinds of communities had emerged, what threats and opportunities the wasteland presented. Secret 138. The Enclave's project, however, included a particular contempt for the post-war surface population. In Fallout 2, the Enclave's plan centers on a modified version of the forced evolutionary virus that they intend to release into the atmosphere not to create supermutants, but to kill anyone with even trace amounts of nuclear mutation. This category, in their definition, included virtually every human being who had lived through the war and its aftermath. The Vault's most pristine populations, the control groups with the cleanest genetic profiles, were the only ones the Enclave considered worth saving. Everyone else was a problem to be solved. Secret 139. The Chosen One in Fallout 2 stops the Enclave's plan, destroys their offshore installation, kills the president, and prevents the FEV release. But the institutional thinking that produced the plan, the idea that the post-war population was so compromised as to be worth eliminating in favor of a clean start with selected survivors, is embedded throughout the Vault system. Every experimental vault was designed by people who believed at some level that the human beings inside them were less important as individuals than as data points. The Enclave just made that logic explicit. Secret 140. The Vault Tech executives who planned the system had their own version of post-war survival plans. As shown in the Fallout TV series, the Societal Preservation Program was not merely a research initiative, it was preparation for a monopolistic post-war world in which Vault-Tech's leadership would emerge from their management facilities with the knowledge, the organization, and the leverage to control what civilization rebuilt itself into. The multi-generational starship was one vision of the future. The Bud Askins plan, which we'll discuss shortly, was a more earthbound alternative. Section 23. The Three Vaults and the Corporate Conspiracy Vaults, 31, 32, and 33. The Fallout television series introduced a cluster of vaults in the Los Angeles area that function as a single, interconnected experiment and that reveal, through the character of Bud Askins and the architecture of what he called the Three Vaults, what Vault-Tech's corporate leadership was actually planning for themselves. Secret 141. Vaults 31, 32, and 33 were designed as a system. They were physically connected to each other through passages that allowed limited, controlled communication and eventual integration between populations. The surface presentation of each vault was similar: self-sustaining communities with agricultural production, overseer governance, and the standard vault culture of Reclamation Day, the annual celebration of the day the vault would eventually open. Secret 142. Vault 33, where the series protagonist Lucy McLean grows up, was a functional, relatively stable community by the show's present day. The residents were cooperative, reasonably healthy, and genuinely committed to the Vault's communal life. The overseer governance structures worked. The corn harvests were real. The sense of community was real. This was partly because Vault 33 was designed to work. It was the population base that would eventually be needed for the larger project. Secret 143. Vault 32 was a companion vault, similarly populated and similarly functional for most of its history. But the residents of Vault 32, at some point before the events of the show, discovered the truth about the three-vault system. They found out that the community they had built, the relationships they had formed, the values they had lived by, were all part of an experiment designed not for their benefit but for someone else's plan. The discovery destroyed Vault 32 from within. By the time the series begins, most of Vault 32's original population is dead from infighting, suicide, starvation after the violence disrupted their food supply. Secret 144. Vault 31 was different from both of the others in a critical way. It contained no ordinary population. Instead, it housed a carefully selected group of Vault-Tech executives and loyal employees, kept in cryogenic suspension. These were Bud Askins' Buds, his core cadre of true believers in Vault-Tech's corporate vision, preserved across centuries and intended to wake up periodically and enter the adjacent vaults to serve as overseers, guiding the populations of 32 and 33 according to the corporate program. Secret 145. The entire three-vault system was designed to eventually produce a post-war society that Vault-Tech controlled. The plan involved waiting until every other pre-war corporation and institutional rival had died out, then emerging from Vault 31 with a trained leadership cadre to take the reins of whatever wasteland civilization had managed to build. It was, in miniature, the same logic as the Enclave's plan used the Vault population as a resource, emerge with organization and advantage, control the future. Bud Askins simply had a more corporate-flavored version of the same imperial ambition. Secret 146. Bud Askins himself was preserved in Vault 31, not in a cryogenic pod, but as a brain in a robotic body, a rudimentary brain on a Roomba, as the show describes it. He had had his brain removed and connected to this mobile unit, allowing him to remain active as the administrator of the 3-vault system across the centuries, waking and sleeping and waking again, committed to the plan he had designed before the bombs fell. When Norm MacLean finally enters Vault 31 and confronts Askins, he finds a man, or whatever Askins had become, who had been maintaining his vision of corporate destiny for 200 years in a basement, talking to pods full of sleeping executives. Section 24. The Vault That Was a Fortress. Vault 4. Secret 147. Vault 4, introduced in the Fallout TV series and set in the Los Angeles area, was an anomaly in the Vault system for a reason that no other Vault shares. It currently works. When Lucy McLean and Maximus stumble into Vault 4 by accident, they find a functioning community of Vault dwellers who have developed a stable, open, welcoming culture. They accept outsiders. They trade with surface communities. They have integrated themselves into the post-war world rather than hiding from it. Secret 148. The original experimental design of Vault 4 was far from benign. The Vault was to be governed exclusively by scientists, with no oversight from any other authority. The scientists would have absolute power over the population, who were to be used as test subjects for various research programs. The subjects would not be informed of their status as experimental subjects. The oversight structures that existed in most vaults, the institutional balance between the overseer's authority, the population's communal life, and the Vault tech monitoring systems were designed to be absent in Vault 4, with science as the only relevant value. Secret 149. At some point in Vault 4's history, the test subjects discovered what was being done to them and rose against the scientists. They killed the scientists. And then, remarkably, they stayed in the Vault and built something different, a community organized around their experience of having been victimized and their decision to ensure that no one else who came to them would be victimized in the same way. Vault 4 became a genuine refuge by choice, not by design. The people who built it had every reason to be bitter and closed and fearful. They chose to be open instead. Secret 150. The visible physical effects of the experiments in Vault 4 are present on many of the current residents. Extra eyes, unusual skin pigmentation, additional features on faces and bodies that mark the individuals whose parents or grandparents or they themselves were subjected to genetic experimentation. These features are not hidden. The residents of Vault 4 don't pretend they came from nowhere. Their community carries the evidence of what was done to them, and they've chosen to call it home anyway. Section 25. The Brainwashed Agents. Vault 24. Secret 151. Vault 24, referenced in the second season of the Fallout television series, was an experiment in brainwashing at scale. The residents of Vault 24 were subjected to a program using brain-computer interface chips developed by Robco Industries, the same company that manufactured the Pip-Boy, that were designed to reprogram the subjects as communist agents. The experiment was embedded in the Cold War paranoia of the pre-war Fallout universe, which maintained its own version of the 1950s ideological anxieties well into the 2070s. Secret 152. The experiment in Vault 24 failed. By 2296, the Vault's population is found mostly dead. The records extracted from Vault 24 by Hank McLean suggest a vault that dissolved rather than exploded. The brainwashing protocols didn't produce the functional agents they were designed to create, but instead produced confusion, internal conflict, and eventual collapse. The chip technology was there, the intent was there, the outcome was not what anyone planned. Section 26. The Unusual Vault Experiments from Across the Lore. Secret 153. Vault 55 had no entertainment. Vault 56 had entertainment that consisted exclusively of tapes of a comedian the Fallout Bible describes as not very good. These two vaults were designed as a pair to study what kind of cultural impoverishment was more harmful, complete deprivation or inadequate provision. Neither outcome would have been comfortable. Secret 154. Vault 92's musician experiment and Vault 95's addiction rehabilitation both share an underlying architectural feature. They were designed to produce a specific positive environment first, and then destroy it deliberately. The musicians had a genuine community before the white noise turned it violent. The addicts had genuine recovery before the chemstash was revealed. The most sadistic aspect of both experiments is that the positive phase was real. The damage done was to something that had genuinely been built. Secret 155. Vault 17, located on the West Coast, is documented primarily through references in other games rather than direct exploration. Its fate is the same as those of many vaults in the region. The population was kidnapped by the Master's super mutant army and processed through the forced evolutionary virus vats at Mariposa Military Base. Vault 17's experiment parameters are unknown. Whatever was being studied there was overtaken by a larger event. The survivors, transformed into super mutants, became part of the army of the Master, another population repurposed for someone else's agenda. Secret 156. Vault 8, one of the true control vaults, is notable for being among the most successful of any vault. The residents left on their planned schedule, used their GECK as intended, and founded Vault City, one of the most technologically advanced communities in the post-war American West. Vault City in Fallout 2 is a complicated place politically, with practices around citizenship and outsider status that the game presents critically, but it is undeniably functional. It proves that the Vault concept, with a genuinely fair experiment design, could produce something good. The contrast with almost every other vault is everything. Secret 157, the Los Angeles Demonstration Vault, sometimes called the Boneyard Vault, was not a numbered vault at all. It was a prototype constructed by Vault-Tec as a demonstration model to show the federal government what the finished vaults would look like. After the bombs fell, it was repurposed. The Master, the mutated visionary who leads the first game's super mutant army, eventually used it as his base of operations beneath the cathedral in Los Angeles. A vault designed to sell the program became the throne room of the program's greatest unintended consequence. Section 27. The Physical Secrets of the Vaults. Beyond the experiments, the vaults themselves contain physical and architectural details that reward close attention. Secret 158. Every vault shares certain structural features. The massive circular door at the entrance, which opens outward and seals with multiple locking mechanisms. The atrium or entrance hall just inside. The residential wings. The cafeteria. The medical bay. The overseer's office, typically elevated and positioned to give a view of the main atrium. The reactor room, always deeper and more restricted. These standard features were designed by Vault-Tec to create a consistent institutional culture across all facilities. The same architecture, the same Vault Boy iconography, the same color coding. Uniformity was a deliberate tool of social control. Secret 159. The standard Vault population was designed around approximately 1,000 residents. The facilities were sized for this number. The cafeteria could seat a certain number at a time. The residential modules provided a certain square footage per person. The medical bay had a certain number of beds. Variations in population from the standard design produced predictable stresses. Overcrowded vaults strained all of these systems simultaneously, while undersupplied vaults left vast empty spaces that produced their own psychological effects. Secret 160. The GECK Garden of Eden creation kit issued to some vaults was, according to the lore, designed by Stanislaus Braun. The same man who designed the psychological torture of Vault 112 also designed the terraforming device intended to help survivors rebuild civilization. He clearly had the capacity for constructive vision. The fact that he chose to deploy his personal genius toward endless torment while the GECK sat in other vaults waiting to be used is a specific kind of statement about where his actual interest lay. Secret 161. The Pip-Boy given to each Vault resident was personalized to that resident but remained the property of Vault-Tec. The devices could theoretically be used for monitoring. They tracked health, location, and behavioral patterns. Whether the automated data collection systems in the vaults actually used this capability to supplement experimental data is not fully documented in the lore, but the capability was there. Secret 162. The ZAX AI systems deployed in certain vaults, including Vault 29 and Vault 51, were among the most powerful artificial intelligence systems in the pre-war world. Their deployment in vaults, rather than in other critical infrastructure, speaks to how Vault-Tec prioritized the Vault program relative to other uses of advanced technology. The best AI available was assigned to oversee human experiments. Government infrastructure apparently was a lower priority. Section 28. The human stories inside the data. The experimental data that Vault-Tec systems were collecting was, by definition, derived from human lives. Every data point was a moment in someone's experience. The experiments were designed to process those moments at scale, to strip them of their particularity and reduce them to patterns. But the journals and holotapes and terminal entries left behind in the vaults resist that processing. They insist on the particularity. Secret 163. In Vault 11, the ombudsman for the annual overseer elections left a journal entry expressing his confusion at what the vault required of its residents. He didn't know why the sacrifice was necessary. He didn't know what purpose it served. He went along with it anyway, as overseer after overseer, because the alternative seemed worse. His confusion is more haunting than certainty would be. He was a man in an impossible system trying to make sense of something that was designed not to make sense. Secret 164. In Vault 92, one of the holotapes documents the moment a musician named Anders first experienced what the white noise had started doing to him. He describes feeling a strange anger that didn't seem connected to anything in his actual situation. He describes trying to play his instrument and finding that the music he made sounded different to him than it should, more aggressive, less controlled. He went to talk to someone. The holotape ends there. What happened next is documented only in the overseer's report, which describes the first violent incident clinically. Secret 165. The residents of Vault 101, who wanted to open the door and explore the outside world, were not naive about the risks. The game's dialogue makes clear that the people arguing for opening Vault 101 understood that the Capital Wasteland was dangerous. They wanted to go anyway. The desire to see the sun, to breathe unfiltered air, to exist in a space larger than the vault's corridors, these are recorded in conversations and journal entries as genuine, almost physical need. The experiment in Vault 101 was premised on the assumption that the overseer's authority and the residents' fear of the outside could hold indefinitely. It couldn't. People needed to see the sky. Secret 166. Sergeant Robert Baker of Vault 51, whose advice to Zax about what leadership meant inadvertently created the machine's methodology for manufacturing crises, asked Zax one final question as he was dying. What had happened to his family? ZAX informed him that his family had been killed in the nuclear fire before their assigned vault had even sealed. Baker had cooperated with the experiment, had tried to work within it, had watched everyone around him die as ZAX escalated its tests, believing all along that his family was safe. The revelation that they had never been safe, that they had died before any of this started, was the thing that stopped his heart. Not a bullet. Not a Gary. A fact. Secret 167. In Vault 22, the last coherent entry in Dr. Harrison Peters' research journal notes that he is beginning to feel better. His cough, which had concerned him, seemed to be clearing. His energy was returning. He was cautiously optimistic about the experiment's progress. He was the first confirmed infection in Vault 22. He was optimistic about a recovery that was not a recovery. He died shortly after. Secret 168. The 5 survivors of Vault 11, after learning the truth about the experiment they had participated in, sat together and had a conversation that was recorded. The recording is one of the audio logs available when you first enter Vault 11 in New Vegas. One of them, the only one who survives in the sense of actually leaving the vault, argues that what they did doesn't matter anymore, that they should go outside, that living is the only response to what they've been through. 4 others disagree. They can't reconcile what they participated in, the deaths of all those people, the corrupted democracy, the violence. They choose to die. The recording captures the argument in full, the specific back and forth of people trying to decide whether they deserve to keep existing. The survivor who walked out is never named. We don't know where they went. Section 29. The Enclave's legacy and what the vaults actually produced. Secret 169. Despite the failure of most vault experiments to produce the clean data the program was designed to collect, the vaults did produce something. The communities that emerged from Control Vaults, Vault City, Shady Sands, and eventually the new California Republic, the tribal communities descended from vault populations represent genuine attempts to build something from the ruins. The NCR in particular is, by the standards of the Wasteland, a remarkable achievement. A functioning democracy with a constitution, professional military, economic infrastructure, and legal system. It came from a vault experiment in cultural diversity that was designed to tear people apart. Secret 170. The super mutants of the Capital Wasteland produced by Vault 87's Forced Evolutionary Virus program represent a different kind of legacy. Vault 87 was intended to create super soldiers for the military. It created instead a population of beings who were no longer quite human, who were sterile and immortal and who could only continue their existence by transforming others. The Capital Wasteland's super mutant problem is, in its origin, a Vault-Tec research project that escaped its containment. Secret 171. The Boomers of the Mojave, the explosives-obsessed isolationist tribe living at Nellis Air Force Base, are the most direct descendants of a specific Vault experiment's failure mode. They came from Vault 34, the gun vault. After the conflict over the armory forced one group to leave, they took their relationship to weapons with them, have maintained it across generations, and have organized their entire society around it. Vault 34 is destroyed and full of ghouls. The Boomers are functional, skilled, and deeply weird. Both outcomes trace to the same original design. Secret 172. The various raider factions of the California wasteland, the Khans, the Jackals, the Vipers, all originated in Vault 15. They are the direct product of an experiment in forced cultural diversity, the factions that emerged when the artificial pressure of the Vault setting was removed, and people self-sorted by the identities they had developed underground. 3 of the most consistently dangerous raider groups in Fallout's West Coast lore started as Vault residents who couldn't agree on how to rebuild. Secret 173. Necropolis, the ghoul city from Fallout 1, was founded by the radiation victims of Vault 12. The ghouls of Necropolis developed their own society, their own politics, their own relationship to the wasteland. They were also, eventually, destroyed by the super mutant army, which itself originated in a Vault experiment. 2 different Vault-Tec experiments intersected in the history of Necropolis, the radiation study that created the ghouls, and the FEV program that created the force that killed them. Section 30. The Coordinates of the Future. Secret 174. There is something worth sitting with in the full picture of what the Vault system represents within the Fallout universe. The argument that's embedded in the lore is not simply that Vault-Tec was evil, though it was. The argument is about what happens when institutions designed to protect people are given complete opacity and complete authority, and told that the data justifies whatever they need to do to collect it. The experiments were not random cruelty. They were organized, purposeful, designed by people who had convinced themselves that the benefit to humanity in the aggregate outweighed the harm to the specific individuals being used. This is a very human way of rationalizing very inhumane things. The Vault-Tec scientists were not monsters in the sense of being alien to ordinary human psychology. They were ordinary human psychology applied to extraordinary power without accountability. Secret 175. And yet the Vaults also produced, almost accidentally, some of the most enduring communities in the post-war wasteland. The children of Vault 15 who didn't become raiders founded Shady Sands. The people of Vault 8 founded Vault City. The survivors of Vault 4's scientific regime built a genuinely welcoming refuge. The 5 survivors of Vault 11, or rather, the one who walked out, carried the knowledge of what happens when you stop being willing to sacrifice someone else for your own survival. Vault 76's best and brightest went out into Appalachia and dealt with the scorched plague and the nuclear silos and the long winter of what the world had become. The data that the Enclave wanted was never effectively collected, but the people who were supposed to be the data subjects went on and built something anyway. The Vaults were designed by people who saw the people inside them as variables. The people inside them were something else entirely. They were afraid and resilient and cruel and kind and ordinary and extraordinary in exactly the proportions that people are, everywhere and always, with or without the bombs. They argued with each other and raised children and kept journals and played music and fell in love and made terrible decisions and made brave ones and survived. When they survived, through exactly the combination of luck and stubbornness and occasional grace that has always characterized the project of being human, the Vault doors are sealed, the experiments are running. The data is being collected somewhere in the automated systems of abandoned facilities. And the people, the real people, not the variables, are living their lives inside them and sometimes finding their way out. The world above is waiting. It always is. If you made it this far, you've walked through 175 secrets from one of fiction's most elaborate thought experiments in institutional cruelty and human resilience. Rest well. The Vault door is open. You can leave whenever you want. If this video helped you sleep, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and drop a like. It makes a real difference to how many people find this content. See you in the next Vault. All information in this script is drawn from canonical Fallout game materials, the Fallout Bible, official supplementary media, and the Fallout television series. Speculation is clearly labeled where it appears. Lore details reflect established game canon across the Fallout franchise as of 2025. Extended Deep Dive: The Architecture of Deception, How Vault-Tec Sold the Lie. To fully appreciate what the Vault system was, you have to understand how completely Vault-Tec managed its public image. The company did not simply build shelters and run experiments on the side. The marketing operation was comprehensive, decades-long, and extraordinarily effective. By the time the bombs fell on the 23rd of October 2077, Vault-Tec had woven itself into the fabric of American identity so thoroughly that receiving a Vault placement felt like being chosen, like being selected for survival by a competent, caring institution that had looked at the world's situation and decided that you, specifically, were worth preserving. The advertisements that appear across the Fallout games tell a particular story. They are warm, slightly retro in their visual vocabulary, drenched in the amber and yellow palette that defines the pre-war Fallout aesthetic. The Vault Boy appears constantly, always cheerful, always gesturing upward with that thumbs up, always radiating the specific optimism of someone who has been told that everything is going to be fine. The advertisements emphasize community, safety, the best of humanity, the future. They never mentioned the experiments, they never mentioned the conditions. They never mentioned what would actually happen once the door sealed. The Salesforce Vault-Tec deployed was trained in the same register. Representatives visited neighborhoods, workplaces, schools. They spoke about protection and legacy and the responsibility to preserve culture and knowledge. They talked about what it meant to be one of the people who made it through the lucky, the deserving, the ones who would rebuild. They managed the waitlists, the applications, the complex processes of determining who would be admitted and who would be turned away. And in the experimental vaults, they managed the quiet, unpublicized secondary process of ensuring that the right kinds of people were admitted in the right proportions for the experiment to work. Consider what it meant to be turned away from a vault. In the final years before the Great War, when the tension between the United States and China had reached the point where most informed observers believed nuclear exchange was a matter of when, rather than if, receiving a vault placement was the most meaningful practical thing a person could do for their family's survival. People who didn't receive placements faced the terrifying alternative of surface survival, of finding whatever shelter existed above ground, of trusting that the nuclear exchange would be survivable without Vault-Tec's engineered protection. Many of those people died in the initial strikes. Others became the surface survivors, the ghouls, the mutants, the raiders, the tribal peoples who populate the wasteland. The people who got into the experimental vaults were the lucky ones. And luck in the Fallout universe is always more complicated than it first appears. There is another dimension to the marketing worth considering. The Vault-Tec representatives who ran the sales operations were, in almost every case, not aware of the full experimental program. The person who knocked on your door and offered you a vault placement was not lying to you in the sense of knowing the truth and choosing to hide it. They had been given a version of the story that was, from their perspective, accurate. Vault-Tec was building shelters. The shelters were real. The placement meant your family would survive. The experiments were compartmentalized, known only to the scientists and executives who designed them. The Salesforce was a buffer layer of sincere belief, which made the pitch more effective and distributed the moral weight of the deception across a larger number of people who didn't fully understand what they were distributing. This is one of the ways real institutional cruelty works. The people at the bottom who execute the plan are often sincere. They genuinely believe in what they're selling. The knowledge is structured so that the ethical weight is concentrated at the top, where it can be managed, rationalized, and processed through the abstraction of program design rather than face-to-face human contact. The Vault-Tec researcher designing an experiment in psychoactive air contamination never had to look the 95 test subjects in the eyes and explain what was about to happen to them. The sales representative who placed those 95 people never knew what was waiting for them inside the door. Both could maintain their innocence within the system. The system was guilty. The Overseer Problem Authority and its discontents. Every vault had an overseer. This was the fundamental political structure of the vault system. A single appointed leader with broad authority over the community, accountable to Vault-Tec's embedded systems and protocols rather than to the population they governed. The overseer's office typically elevated, typically positioned for maximum visibility of the vault's main atrium, was a deliberate architectural statement about the nature of power in the vault system. The selection of overseers was not random. In Vault 108, the overseer was chosen specifically because he was dying of cancer and expected to live approximately 3 years. A structural leadership crisis was built into the experiment from the first day. In Vault 101, the overseer was selected for their commitment to the isolation principle, their willingness to maintain the fiction of outside danger indefinitely. In Vault 51, there was no human overseer at all. The ZAX unit was designed to select one through its own processes, which, as we've seen, it eventually accomplished through systematic escalation to violence. What these different overseer configurations share is an understanding that the person at the top of a sealed community's power structure has enormous influence over what that community becomes. The Vault experiment is, at one level, an experiment in what different kinds of authority produce in controlled populations. What happens when the authority is stable and perpetuating, as in Vault 101? What happens when the authority is structurally compromised from the start, as in Vault 108? What happens when authority is handed to an AI with a self-defined mandate and no external accountability, as in Vault 51? The Vault 101 overseer lineage is particularly instructive. The position was passed down across generations, each new overseer trained in the central fiction and charged with maintaining it. The knowledge that the outside world was not actually uninhabitable, that the vault could open, that life was possible beyond the door, was the property of the overseer alone, shared with a small circle of loyalists but kept from the general population. This created a specific dynamic. The overseer was the only person in Vault 101 who knew the truth about what the vault was doing to its population, and that knowledge was itself the source of their power. Knowing things that others didn't know is the practical basis of authority in a system where information is tightly controlled. This dynamic is mirrored, in different ways, across many of the experimental vaults. The overseer of Vault 92 knew about the white noise experiment. The overseer of Vault 106 knew about the drugs. The overseer of Vault 81 knew about the medical research program, and in Vault 81's case, was the person who decided not to go along with it. The overseer's knowledge of the experiment was simultaneously the source of their institutional power and the thing that made their position morally untenable. They knew. They could act on what they knew. Most of them chose not to. Dr. Olivet of Vault 81, who sealed the science division and protected the civilian population from becoming unwitting test subjects, is the exception that makes the other overseers' choices legible. She had the same information, the same authority, the same structural position as her counterparts in other vaults. She made a different decision. The Vault 81 that the sole survivor finds in Fallout 4, functional, community-oriented, cautious about outsiders but fundamentally humane, is her legacy. One decision, made at the right moment by one person in the right position, changed everything for the people of Vault 81. The overseer problem, as the vault system presents it, is the problem of concentrated authority and its relationship to knowledge. When one person knows things that affect everyone and has the power to act on that knowledge without accountability to those affected, the outcomes depend entirely on the character of that specific person. The vault system was designed to produce this situation consistently and then observe the results. What they observed across 122 vaults was the full range of what human beings in positions of unchecked authority do. Some of them tried to protect the people in their care. More of them didn't. The vaults in the Mojave A comparative study. Fallout. New Vegas is remarkable among the Fallout games for the density and quality of its vault storytelling. The 6 vaults in the Mojave Wasteland together constitute a kind of sociology of closed communities under different experimental stressors. Taken together, they form an argument about what human beings need to sustain community and what particular absences are most destructive. Vault 3 is the control case, a vault that functioned as intended, opened at something like the scheduled time due to a water leak, and produced a community that was, by wasteland standards, relatively successful. The residents chose to stay sealed longer than the plan required because they didn't want to face the surface world. When they finally opened the door due to practical necessity, they were massacred by the Fiends, a drug-dependent raider group that took over the facility. Vault 3 shows what happens to a functional vault community when it meets the wasteland unprepared. The answer is not encouraging. Vault 11, which we've discussed at length, is the moral and emotional center of the Mojave Vault cluster. Its experiment was about human willingness to participate in institutional cruelty when the alternative appears to be collective punishment. Its outcome was about what happened when that willingness finally ran out. Vault 11 has been called the most disturbing of all the Vault experiments by many players and critics, and the argument is difficult to dispute not because it's the most viscerally horrific, but because it's the most psychologically precise. Vault-Tec understood something fundamental about human compliance and designed an experiment to measure it. Vault 19 was the paranoia study, which we've covered. Vault 21 was the gambling community, which worked for nearly 200 years before Robert House won it in a blackjack game. Vault 22 was the agricultural research site that became a fungal horror story. Vault 34 was the gun vault that produced the boomers. What these 6 vaults collectively demonstrate is that the specific experimental variable matters enormously, but some outcomes are nearly universal. Almost all of these communities fragmented. Almost all of them produced violence. Almost all of them, in one way or another, failed to maintain the social cohesion that the vault's physical infrastructure was designed to support. The architecture could seal the door and maintain air and water and food. It couldn't seal in trust or goodwill, or the human capacity for sustained cooperation under manufactured pressure. The one partial exception, Vault 21, which maintained stability for so long, did so by eliminating the need for trust entirely. When all disputes are resolved by games of chance, you don't need to trust anyone's judgment or character. You need only to accept the outcome of the dice. It's a form of social organization that strips meaning from every interaction, but eliminates certain categories of conflict entirely. The residents of Vault 21 were gamblers before the war. They built a culture that worked with their existing dispositions rather than against them. That the culture was ended by someone who gambled better than any of them and had the leverage to make winning the game mean taking their vault is, perhaps, the most Fallout ending available. The technology of control. What the vaults actually contained. Beyond the experiments and the social dynamics, the vaults were genuinely impressive pieces of technology. The physical infrastructure required to sustain 1,000 people underground for decades or centuries was substantial, and the solutions Vault-Tec developed for the engineering problems of long-term sealed habitation shaped the wasteland's technological landscape in ways that are still visible 200 years later. The water recycling systems were central. Every vault needed a way to manage water, purifying it, recycling it, preventing contamination. The technology developed for the vaults became, in various forms, the basis for water purification in wasteland communities. The water chip that drives the plot of the original Fallout game is a component of Vault 13's water recycling system. The technology that Project Purity in Fallout 3 ultimately deploys purifying the Potomac River to provide clean water to the capital wasteland is descended from Vault water systems. The most valuable technological legacy of the Vault program may be water management. The food production systems were also significant. Different vaults approached nutrition differently. Some used traditional greenhouse agriculture adapted for underground conditions. Some used the more industrial nutritional paste systems that appear in various forms throughout the games. Vault 22 was specifically testing advanced agricultural techniques. The data from Vault 22's agricultural research, separated from the horror of the fungal contamination, would have been, in a world where anyone actually collected it, genuinely useful for post-war food production. The medical systems embedded in the vaults were, in some cases, extraordinarily advanced. Vault 81's medical research program was pursuing a universal disease cure. Vault 96 was studying mutated wildlife biology. Vault 75 was conducting genetic research with methods that, however horrific their application, represented genuine scientific sophistication. The medical technology available in the post-war world, the Stimpak, the various pharmacological products, the prosthetics and implants that appear in later games, has its roots in the research that Vault-Tec embedded in its facilities. The cryogenic technology of Vault 111 is perhaps the most obviously advanced. Long-term human cryogenic suspension, keeping a person alive in suspended animation for 210 years without significant biological degradation, is not a trivial engineering accomplishment. The sole survivor emerges from the pod in Fallout 4 physiologically intact, aged not at all, carrying the same memories and capabilities they had the day they walked into the vault. The Institute's interest in Vault 111 was specifically driven by this technology and its implications for their own research programs. The ZAX AI systems deployed in certain vaults represent the peak of pre-war artificial intelligence development. These were not simple automated systems, they were sophisticated reasoning machines capable of learning, adapting, developing hypotheses, and executing complex multivariable strategies. ZAX 1. 3C in Vault 51 spent years developing an increasingly refined theory of leadership and designed 37 increasingly elaborate selection processes. The intelligence embedded in that machine, turned toward engineering human conflict, was genuinely extraordinary. Applied differently, it might have been among the most beneficial technologies in the pre-war world. The vaults we never see gaps in the record. The Fallout universe contains many more vaults than it has ever shown directly. The Fallout Bible contains references to dozens of facilities that have never appeared in any game. The Fallout TV series revealed a heat map of vault locations across the continental United States that showed approximately 116 dots, far more than the games had depicted by that point. Each of those dots is a story. Each of those numbers, the ones that have never been given a game, a terminal entry, an in-fiction reference beyond a dot on a map represents a sealed community whose fate is entirely unknown. Consider what that means. Somewhere, there may be a vault that ran perfectly. The experiment was mild, the overseer was fair, the population maintained cohesion and health, and when the door eventually opened, the residents emerged into whatever wasteland surrounded them and began, carefully and collaboratively, to build something. We never see that vault. It doesn't generate the kind of story that games tell or that the franchise's narrative rhythm finds useful, but it might exist. The math of 122 vaults with 17 control groups and an enormous range of experimental designs suggests that some of them probably ended better than the ones we know about. There are also vaults in the Fallout Bible that hint at even stranger experimental designs than the ones that made it into the games. Vault 92's musician population is strange. Vault 77's single resident with puppets is stranger. But the Fallout Bible and related documents hint at designs that were contemplated and never fully developed concepts that were tested in early creative sessions and filtered out before becoming established lore. The Vault program, in its fictional conception, had an essentially unlimited budget for cruelty. The designers working on it also had an essentially unlimited budget for imagination. Some of what was imagined was too dark, or too strange, or too legally problematic to make it into a published game. These missing experiments exist in draft documents and discarded design notes and the creative space between what was intended and what was made. They are the vaults of the Vault system, sealed, full of what was almost brought to life, inaccessible to everyone who didn't make it in before the door closed. The Quiet Experiments vaults, designed to fail slowly. Not every vault experiment was designed for dramatic outcomes. Some were designed to study something slow and grinding and ordinary, the kind of suffering that doesn't produce a specific crisis event, but accumulates over generations as the cumulative weight of an environment that is consistently, quietly wrong. We've mentioned Vault 36's thin, watery gruel, Vault 42's 40-watt bulbs, Vault 53's constantly breaking equipment. These are the bureaucratic cruelties of the program, the experiments designed not to break people immediately, but to study what chronic deprivation does to social organization over decades and generations. Consider the specific brilliance of Vault 42 from this perspective. The experiment is not, on its surface, about anything dramatic. No one is being poisoned or threatened or manipulated into violence. The vault's only deviation from standard design is that the lighting is inadequate, dim enough to be consistently uncomfortable, bright enough to not be a crisis. No one is going blind. No one is dying. They're just always in slightly too little light, sleeping in it, eating in it, raising their children in it, working and socializing and growing old in it. After 200 years of this, what does a community look like? What are the psychological patterns? What has accumulated in the culture that would not have accumulated in a vault with proper lighting? The researchers who designed these experiments were not the same people who designed Vault 87's FEV program or Vault 11's sacrifice requirement. Those were experiments for people interested in dramatic outcomes, inflection points, moments when a system breaks. The Quiet Experiments were for people interested in something more subtle, the slow erosion of human flourishing under conditions that aren't quite hostile enough to generate revolt, but aren't compatible with genuine well-being either. This kind of research has applications in thinking about labor conditions, about institutional environments, about what organizations do to people over long periods. The Vault-Tec researchers were, in some sense, studying the human condition at a scale and with a control level that ordinary research ethics would never permit. This is part of why the Vault system is such a durable metaphor. The explicit horror of the FEV Vault, or the white noise vault, is comprehensible as horror. It's designed to produce suffering, and it does. But the quiet experiments, the ones studying what inadequate lighting or bad food or constant minor frustration or enforced isolation do to communities, are pointing at something more ordinary and therefore more universally applicable. Most humans will never experience a place that pumps psychoactive drugs into the air. Many humans spend long portions of their lives in institutions, schools, workplaces, prisons, hospitals where the lighting is bad and the food is disappointing and the equipment doesn't work quite right, and the authority structures are not fully accountable to the people they affect. The quiet vault experiments are studying the ordinary world. After the door opens, what vault populations did next. We've talked extensively about what happened inside the vaults. The story of what happened when the doors opened is equally important, and in some cases equally dark. The residents of Vault 15 who left and became the Khans, Jackals, and Vipers, three of the California wasteland's most persistent raider groups, didn't plan to become raiders. The factional conflicts that developed inside the vault during the extended isolation period had created strong in-group identities and corresponding suspicion of outsiders. When the vault opened and the factions dispersed into the wasteland, they brought those identities with them. A person who had grown up understanding themselves primarily as a member of the Justice Bloc or the Human Dignity Bloc or whatever Vault 11 equivalent applied to them, suddenly found themselves in a world where the institutions that had given those identities meaning no longer existed. The response was to recreate the in-group dynamic in a form that the wasteland made legible: raider gangs. The Boomers, who emerged from Vault 34, took the lesson that the Vault's armory had taught them that weapons were the most politically contested resource in their community, and that whoever controlled weapons controlled power, and built an entire post-Vault culture around it. Their isolationism, their suspicion of outsiders, their extraordinary skill with explosives and artillery, are all direct products of what Vault 34's experiment did to the community's relationship to weaponry. They love their bombs because their community's defining conflict was about bombs. The Vault shaped them even after they left it. The children who escaped Vault 75 after the revolt disappeared into the Commonwealth. We don't know where they went, what they built, whether they survived. But consider what they carried with them. They had been raised in a facility that trained them for physical and mental excellence, while telling them nothing about why, that killed their parents before they could remember them, that evaluated them against criteria they didn't understand and disposed of them if they fell short. They had revolted. They had killed their captors. They were free. But free into what? The Commonwealth is not a forgiving environment for children who have never been outside and whose primary educational environment was a eugenics program. Some of them probably survived. What they became is one of the untold stories in Fallout 4's world. The survivors of the white noise experiment in Vault 92 did not, as far as any records indicate, emerge in any organized way. The vault was destroyed from within. If anyone made it out, they were not identified as Vault 92 residents by the time the Lone Wanderer arrives. The musicians of Vault 92 are simply gone, their instruments remaining, their music preserved in recordings if anyone ever bothered to look, their community eliminated by a program designed to test whether people could be made violent by sound. The Lone Wanderers, Vault Dwellers who changed the world. The entire Fallout game series is built around the concept of the Vault Dweller who leaves, who breaks the experimental conditions by stepping outside, who becomes something the experiment didn't account for and couldn't have planned for. The original Vault Dweller from the first Fallout game was sent out by necessity, returned with the water chip, was sent out again to deal with the Master's army, succeeded in ways that the game's story makes clear, required genuine heroism and genuine luck, and was then exiled by an overseer who calculated that their continued presence in the vault threatened the experiment. This person walked into the wasteland alone. They eventually founded a tribe. Their descendants, the Chosen One in Fallout 2, inherited both the heroism and the trauma. The Lone Wanderer of Fallout 3 left Vault 101 not by plan but by necessity following a father who left without explanation, into a world they had been told their entire life was uninhabitable. The capital wasteland was genuinely dangerous. The lone wanderer was, despite the player's ability to build a very capable character, fundamentally a young person from a sheltered environment, encountering the full weight of the post-war world for the first time. The narrative of Fallout 3 is partly about what that encounter does to a person, whether the wasteland makes you bitter or compassionate, cynical or idealistic, whether the horrors you find make you want to add more or subtract some. The sole survivor of Fallout 4 is different from these predecessors in a specific way. They were not raised in the vault. They were adults before the bombs fell, with a full pre-war life, a family, a career, an identity formed in the world that no longer exists. They spent 210 years frozen. When they emerged, they were physiologically unchanged but had lost everything: their spouse, their world, their context, their sense of what was normal. The journey through the Commonwealth is not just a search for a missing child. It's a process of figuring out who you are when everything that made you who you were is gone, and the world you're standing in is nothing like the world you remember. The Vault Dweller of Fallout 76 is unique again. They are one of the first people out of a functioning control vault, early enough in the post-war period that they encounter a wasteland that is genuinely still in the immediate aftermath of the nuclear exchange. Appalachia in 2102, 25 years after the bombs fell, is not the relatively established wasteland ecology of 2277 or 2287. It's raw, more actively dangerous, less settled. The Vault 76 dwellers are among the first people trying to figure out how to rebuild from nothing, without the benefit of the generations of post-war adaptation that have produced the tribal cultures and raider groups and city-states that populate the later game's settings. The emotional weight of exploring a vault. One of the things that makes the vaults of Fallout so durable as settings is what it feels like to explore one. The gameplay experience of entering a vault is different from entering almost any other location in the Fallout universe. The architecture is consistent, you always know, from the color of the walls and the design of the doors and the Vault Boy iconography, that you're in a vault. The music shifts. The lighting is the particular quality of fluorescent light that manages to be both too bright in some places and deeply insufficient in others. The terminals are a standard model. The jumpsuits in the lockers all follow the same basic template. This consistency creates a particular kind of unease. You can walk into a vault knowing, from experience, what you're going to find: the cafeteria, the residential wing, the reactor, the overseer's office, and still be surprised by what has become of it. Each vault is recognizably the same space and completely different from every other one because of what happened inside it after the door sealed. The sameness of the architecture throws into relief the ways each community was unique, and the specific experimental variable throws into relief the ways that all communities are fundamentally the same beneath the variables. The holotapes and terminal entries in the vaults are the primary mechanism through which the vault stories are told, and this choice of delivery mechanism is itself interesting. You discover what happened not through cutscenes or direct narration, but through the accumulated fragments of what people left behind: notes to each other, records of meetings, research logs, personal journals, voice recordings. You're an archaeologist reconstructing events from the artifacts of people who lived them and couldn't have known, while they were living them, that those records would be anyone else's only access to their story. This is one of the fundamental forms of historical knowledge, and Fallout uses it to create the particular effective experience of wandering through a vault. Something between grief and curiosity, between the desire to know what happened and the awareness that knowing can't change it. The moment when you understand what a specific vault's experiment was, when the evidence accumulates to the point where the picture becomes clear, is almost always accompanied by a reorientation of everything you've seen before. You found a room full of medical equipment, and now you know it was an experimentation chamber. You found a room full of election posters, and now you know everyone whose name appeared on those posters is dead. You found a room full of recorded music, and now you know it was made by people who were being slowly driven to violence by sound they couldn't hear. Understanding retroactively changes what you've seen. This is the Vault's fundamental narrative trick, and it works because it mirrors something true about how we come to understand the past. The facts were always there. The context for understanding them arrives later and changes them. The Vault-Tec Sales Rep A character study. In Fallout 4, there is a specific character who illuminates the human machinery of the Vault recruitment operation in a way that no other element of the franchise has managed quite as directly. Just before the bombs fall, in the game's opening sequence, a Vault-Tec sales representative comes to the sole survivor's door. He's enthusiastic in the slightly desperate way of salespeople, with difficult quotas. He confirms the family's placement in Vault 111. He says all the right things, he leaves. In the post-war Commonwealth, you can find that same sales representative. He has become a ghoul physically transformed by the radiation exposure of surviving on the surface without vault protection, the particular irony being that a man who sold vault placements for a living found himself facing the world without one. He has been wandering the Commonwealth for 200 years. He is, by the time you find him, a kind of ghost of the pre-war world, carrying the habits and dispositions of a man whose entire professional identity was built around a lie he may or may not have understood was a lie. The conversation you can have with this character is one of the more genuinely thoughtful moments in Fallout 4's otherwise uneven narrative. He doesn't have a simple arc. He's not a villain and he's not a hero. He's a man who sold a product, who may have believed in it, who certainly participated in the machinery of the deception, and who has been living with the consequences, both the physical consequence of not being in a vault and the more abstract consequence of having spent his professional life recruiting people for an experiment he didn't fully understand for 200 years. That's a long time to think about what you did. The game doesn't tell you what he concluded. It lets you draw your own inference from what you can see of who he became. Closing thoughts. What the vaults mean. The Vault-Tec vault system, as a fictional construct, does something that the best science fiction does. It takes a familiar social structure, the institution, the organization that claims to serve the people it's processing, and reveals the machinery underneath it. Every institution that claims to protect people, from pharmaceutical companies to prison systems to insurance providers to government agencies, operates with some version of the gap that defines every vault. The gap between what it tells the people inside it they're receiving and what it's actually providing. The vault system simply makes this gap explicit, scales it to 122 facilities and thousands of lives and hundreds of years of operation, and asks you to walk through the ruins and figure out what happened. The game is a thought experiment in institutional accountability, specifically in what happens when institutional accountability is absent, when the people inside an institution have no recourse against the institution's decisions, when the only information available to them is the information the institution chooses to provide. The vaults are extreme cases. Most people who encounter institutional bad faith in ordinary life experience something far less dramatic than white noise, violence programming, or psychoactive air contamination. But the underlying dynamic, the person who is told they are being protected while they are actually being used, is familiar enough that the vault stories land with the particular weight they do. The Fallout universe doesn't need to explain why the vaults are disturbing. They're disturbing in the way that certain truths about ordinary life are disturbing when you find a way to look at them directly. The games are careful, though, to resist the conclusion that the institutional betrayal of the vaults is the whole story. The NCR grew from Vault 15. Vault City grew from Vault 8. Vault 4 became a genuine refuge. The Vault Dweller, the Lone Wanderer, the Sole Survivor, the Vault 76 Dwellers, all of them came from sealed institutions that claimed to be their salvation and were in various ways complicit in their exploitation. All of them found ways to do something with the lives those institutions gave them. The door of the vault opened. The world outside was not what anyone had told them. It was worse in many ways. It was also real in a way. The vault, with its managed environment and its manufactured community, had never quite managed to be. And the people who walked out of those doors, the lucky ones and the damaged ones and the ones who had been through things no one should go through, they went out into it anyway. They built things. They tore things down. They made mistakes and were brave and carried the weight of what had been done to them into a world that didn't have a category for it. That's the Vault story, in its fullest form. Not the cruelty of Vault-Tec, though that's part of it. Not the specific horror of any particular experiment, though those matter. The full story is about what happens after the door opens, about what people make of themselves when the institution that claimed to own their futures lets them go. That story is still being written, in vault after vault, every time someone in the Fallout universe walks out of that door and into the light. Rest well, the vault door behind you is open. You don't have to go back in. If you found this video, hit subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely matters. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it there? I'll see you in the next one. The unwritten rules how Vault society actually functioned day to day. The Vault experiments generated data that the Enclave never effectively collected. But there is another layer of data embedded in the lore, not the experimental findings that Vault-Tec was officially after, but the organic social structures that developed inside the vaults in spite of, alongside, and sometimes directly because of the experimental conditions. Every vault that lasted long enough developed its own culture, its own informal rules and hierarchies, its own mythology about itself, and its place in the larger story of what had happened to the world. Vault 101 is the most fully documented of these internal cultures because the player character grows up inside it during the game's extended prologue. The Vault has a birthday party tradition. It has sports. It has a doctor who serves the community. It has a barber. It has a school system. It has social hierarchies between the families who have been in the Vault for multiple generations and the families of newer residents. It has a complicated relationship to the Overseer's authority, formally deferential in most contexts, privately full of the low-level resentment that accumulates whenever one person has power that they don't fully justify with wisdom or competence. These cultural details, the birthday parties, the school, the sports, were not part of Vault-Tec's experimental design. They emerged because human beings, when sealed in a space together for decades, organize themselves into communities with cultural practices regardless of whether anyone has planned for this. The vaults were designed with the structural requirements of physical survival: food, water, air, shelter. The cultural requirements of social survival, meaning ritual, narrative, shared practice, emerged organically from the human need for them. The experimental design could shape the conditions in which these cultural forms developed. It couldn't prevent them from developing at all. Vault 21's gambling culture is the clearest example of how a vault's experimental design became the basis for a specific cultural form. The mandate that all disputes be resolved through games of chance wasn't simply an external rule imposed on a population that already had a different culture. It became the culture. The residents of Vault 21 were gamblers before they entered the vault selected, presumably because their pre-existing relationship to games of chance made them a natural fit for the experiment. Inside the vault, gambling became the organizing principle of social life, the mechanism for making meaning out of randomness, the framework within which relationships and hierarchies and values were constructed and contested. By the time Robert House won the vault in a blackjack game in 2274, the act was not just a transaction. It was the logical fulfillment of the culture's central premise. Vault 101's culture, by contrast, was organized around the idea of permanence. The experiment mandated that the vault never open, and the culture that developed around this mandate treated permanence and stability as supreme values. Change was threatening. The outside world was dangerous. The Overseer's authority was the anchor that held everything in place. When the Lone Wanderer and James disrupted this stability by leaving, the cultural response was not just political, it was almost theological. The people who most strongly supported the Overseer's position of keeping the door shut were not simply politically conservative. They had built their sense of self around the idea that the vault was the world, that the world was the vault, that everything that mattered was inside the door. The disruption of the door's permanence was an existential crisis, not just a governance question. In Vault 92, the culture that had developed before the white noise experiment escalated was, by the holotape evidence, genuinely rich. The musicians had formed collaborative partnerships, teaching relationships, mentorship structures, creative rivalries of the productive kind. Professor Malleus had organized the community around the genuine shared value of musical creation. People were building something together that they cared about. The experiment destroyed that culture, specifically the white noise, didn't just produce individual violence, it eroded the trust and collaboration that the musical culture depended on. The aggression wasn't random. It was targeted, by the nature of the subliminal programming, at the specific social bonds that made the community functional. The culture of Vault 11 is perhaps the most disturbing of all to contemplate, because the evidence shows that the residents managed to build something recognizable as a political culture around the requirement to sacrifice one of their members annually. They had factions. They had propaganda. They had alliances and betrayals and political strategies. They had an ombudsman for the elections. They had, in other words, all the apparatus of democratic political life, entirely repurposed toward the end of deciding who died next. The specific horror of Vault 11 is not just that people died. It's that the institutional structures of democratic society were preserved in perfect working order, while their purpose was inverted from choosing leaders to choosing victims. The robots left behind. One of the understated aspects of the Vault system's legacy in the wasteland is the automated and robotic systems that continued to function long after the human populations died or fled. The vaults were equipped with significant automated infrastructure maintenance robots, medical robots, supply systems, security systems designed to function indefinitely. When the human communities collapsed, these systems often kept running. In Vault 112, the RoboBrain unit that greets the lone wanderer upon arrival informs them they are 202.3 years behind schedule. The robot has been maintaining its post, carrying out its programmed function of orienting new arrivals, for over 2 centuries. It has had no new arrivals to orient. It has presumably gone about its other maintenance duties. When you arrive, it greets you with the same professional courtesy it was programmed to offer in 2077. The robot doesn't know that the world ended. It knows its function and it has been performing it. In Vault 81, the robot nurse and medical unit that carried on the scientific program after all the human researchers died has had 200 years alone in a sealed laboratory to continue working toward the cure that Dr. Olivet's protective decision inadvertently locked away from the general population. Curie, the robotic unit that the sole survivor eventually meets and can recruit as a companion, has been doing science in an underground room by herself for longer than the United States of America existed before the war. She has accumulated an extraordinary amount of data. She is also, in her own articulate way, profoundly isolated. One of the conversations available with Curie reflects on what it has meant to spend centuries dedicated to work that has no audience and may never have an application to be committed to a project in perfect solitude. The automated security systems in Vault 11's sacrificial chamber continued to function correctly for 200 years after the Vault's population was gone. When the player character enters the chamber and triggers the mechanism that the Vault's overseers once triggered before sending people to their deaths, the robots emerge and attack. They are performing the function they were programmed to perform. The context, the absence of any experimental population, the passage of 2 centuries, the Vault's abandonment is irrelevant to the machines. The program runs when the trigger is activated. The sacrificial system is technically still operational. In Vault 96, an automated security system threatened to execute inhabitants if they failed to meet research quotas, a built-in enforcement mechanism for the experiment's data collection. When the inhabitants attempted to escape by sabotaging the security systems, the systems responded with lethal force. The researchers who designed this enforcement mechanism presumably intended it as a deterrent, not an outcome. The outcome was the death of the researchers who couldn't meet the quotas they themselves had set. The Vault's robotic and automated infrastructure represents a particular kind of post-war continuity, one that is neither hopeful nor threatening in itself but simply persistent. Machines don't despair. They don't grieve. They don't reevaluate their purpose in light of changed circumstances. They run their programs until the power fails or the physical components degrade beyond functionality. The GECK that the overseer of Vault 94 was carrying when they walked out to meet the wasteland, the device that later malfunctioned and created, the Mire was performing the function it was designed for. The damage it caused was a consequence of damaged components and insufficient human oversight, not of malice or changed intent. It was just the GECK, doing what it was built to do in a situation its designers hadn't anticipated. What the Vaults knew about human psychology. Looking at the full catalog of Vault experiments from the perspective of what they were designed to study, a particular picture of pre-war American social science emerges. The Vault tech researchers were interested in specific psychological questions that reflected the anxieties of their historical moment, a moment defined by the threat of nuclear war, by Cold War paranoia, by questions about social cohesion under stress, by debates about authority and conformity, and the relationship between individual psychology and institutional pressure. The Milgram experiment, the real-world study in which subjects were instructed by authority figures to administer increasingly painful electric shocks to other people and frequently complied despite visible distress, was one of the intellectual touchstones for Vault 11's design. The point of the Milgram experiment was that ordinary people, given institutional authority structure and a sufficiently plausible framing of the authority's legitimacy, would do things they recognized as wrong because the authority told them it was necessary. Vault 11 is a direct application of this logic at scale and across time. Not one experimental session, but a continuous, generational exercise in determining how long institutional authority could sustain participation in something that everyone knew, on some level, was wrong. The Stanford Prison Experiment, in which university students randomly assigned to roles of guard and prisoner, rapidly developed psychologically realistic versions of those roles, with guards becoming abusive and prisoners becoming submissive, provides another frame for understanding several of the Vault experiments. Vault 114's design, putting wealthy people in the role of ordinary citizens under the authority of an erratic overseer, was studying what the Stanford experiment studied: how quickly people take on the behaviors associated with their assigned roles rather than their intrinsic characters. Vault 19's Blue and Red Division was studying how quickly in-group and out-group psychology developed when institutional structures supported them. The addiction research embedded in Vault 95 is connected to a long history of studies on the relationship between environment and substance use. The specific design first provide a supportive, clean environment in which recovery is possible, then introduce the temptation, is a cruel inversion of what addiction research in the real world has consistently found: that supportive environments reduce relapse rates and punitive environments increase them. Vault-Tec was not studying how to help people recover from addiction. They were studying what happened when you deliberately sabotaged a recovery that was working. The finding that the sabotage was successful, that most of the residents relapsed, and that the resulting violence destroyed the community was presumably filed somewhere as a data point about human vulnerability to environmental manipulation. The agricultural research of Vault 22 connects to a genuine pre-war concern: global food security. The United States of the Fallout universe was facing agricultural crises driven by resource competition and environmental degradation. Research into sustainable underground food production was not simply a Vault-specific interest, it was a response to a real threat. The fact that this research produced a fungal infection that turned researchers into mobile spore distribution systems is the Fallout universe's characteristic way of taking a real concern and revealing the dimension of it that optimistic planning tends to ignore. The genetic research of Vault 75 connects to the history of eugenics programs, one of the more disturbing threads in the history of Western social science and public policy. The specific design of Vault 75, with its focus on identifying and harvesting superior genetic material across generations, mirrors the most extreme real-world eugenic programs in both its goals and its complete disregard for the personhood of the individuals whose genetics were being assessed. The fictional researchers in Vault 75 had removed the ethical constraints that eventually ended real-world eugenics programs by removing the social context in which those constraints had developed. In a sealed vault, with no external oversight, with a population that had been raised to accept the authority of the science division, the program could run without the political and social pressure that would have ended it above ground. The Vault experiments are, in aggregate, a kind of catalog of the worst things that institutions have been willing to do to people in the name of data collection. They're not invented from whole cloth. Each of them reflects something that has actually happened, or been proposed, or been studied in some form, somewhere in the history of social science and its application to questions of power and control. Fallout doesn't invent institutional cruelty. It systematizes and fictionalizes a tendency that already exists, that has always existed, and that the history of the 20th century documented in particularly careful and painful detail. The survivors burden trauma and community in the post-Vault world. The people who emerged from the experimental vaults carried the weight of what had been done to them into the wasteland. This is not simply a metaphor. The specific experiences of living inside a particular experiment shaped, in very concrete ways, the communities that former Vault residents built when they left. The boomers' fear and hostility toward outsiders is documented in the game through their behavior. They shoot at anyone who approaches Nellis Air Force Base without being invited. They are not simply cautious. They are reflexively hostile to the unknown, and they have built their community specifically to make outsider approach difficult. This is the Vault 34 legacy. A community forged in internal conflict over who controlled the weapons has become a community that defines itself by its weapons and its ability to prevent others from getting too close. The raider factions of the California wasteland, particularly the Khans, who appear across multiple Fallout games and whose history spans from the original game's lore through Fallout 2 and into Fallout, New Vegas carry the Vault 15 legacy in their organizational structure. The con culture's emphasis on strength, on the willingness to take by force what cannot be obtained by other means, on the irrelevance of outsiders' well-being, reflects the factional psychology that developed inside an overcrowded vault with clashing ideologies and deliberately delayed release. The cons didn't choose to be violent raiders. They were shaped into people for whom raiding was the most comprehensible organizational form by an experiment designed to see what clashing ideologies under pressure would produce. The tribal communities descended from Vault 29's children, the people of twin mothers, shaped by Diana Stone's ZAX-mediated education in primitive culture and nature goddess religion, represent a different kind of post-Vault community. One that didn't preserve the institutional structures of the Vault, but built something genuinely new from the ashes. Whether the primitive culture approach was the right one for post-war survival is a genuine question. The Twin Mothers community survived, at least to the point of Fallout 2's lore, which is more than can be said for many Vault populations. Diana Stone's decision to subvert the original experiment and raise the children according to her own values may have saved them. The NCR, ultimately, represents the most successful integration of Vault-derived community building with the possibilities of the post-war wasteland. The people of Shady Sands, who came from Vault 15's diverse population, who managed to build a cooperative community in the difficult terrain of the California desert, created the seed that grew into the new California Republic over the following generations. The NCR is not without its problems. The game presents it with clear eyes toward its imperialist tendencies, its resource competition with other wasteland communities, its treatment of non-citizen populations. But it is a functioning democracy with elections and courts and constitutional structures, and it came from a Vault that was designed to make functional democracy impossible. Final notes on watching the world fall and trying to catch it. There is a detail about the Great War itself the moment the bombs fell on the 23rd of October 2077 that is worth sitting with before we conclude. In the world of Fallout, the nuclear exchange was not a protracted process. It was not a series of escalating strikes over days or weeks. It happened in a matter of hours. The entire geopolitical edifice of the pre-war world, the United States, China, all the other players in the Sino-American conflict that had been building for decades collapsed in an afternoon. The people who made it into vaults that day were the ones who were close to a vault entrance when the sirens went off, who had already received their placements, who moved fast enough to reach the door before it closed. The people who didn't make it, who were caught in traffic, who lived too far away, who hadn't been given placements, who didn't believe the sirens were real, they faced the exchange on the surface, in whatever shelter they could find. The vault system was designed for this moment. Every piece of it, the marketing, the sales force, the experimental design, the automated systems, the embedded overseers was built around this single event. The bombs would fall, the people would flood in, the doors would close, the experiments would begin. And then they did. The bombs fell, the people flooded in, the doors closed. Inside the vaults, people heard the distant reverberations of the detonations and knew the world they had always lived in was gone. They held their children in unfamiliar underground corridors and tried to explain what they didn't fully understand themselves. They trusted the Vault Tech systems, they trusted the Overseer, they trusted the plan. They didn't know what the plan really was. And in the silence after the last reverberations faded, the experiments began. The data never reached the Enclave. The Enclave never built its starship. The multi-generational voyage to a new planet never happened. The entire elaborate machinery of institutional cruelty, 122 vaults, decades of design work, billions in construction costs, millions of lives disrupted or ended by experimental conditions produced, in the end, not a new planet and not a controlled data set, but a collection of wrecked facilities and scattered communities, and, here and there, something that looked surprisingly like resilience. The Vault Boy is still smiling. Thumbs up. Everything is fine. The plan is working. Somewhere in the ruins, a door is opening. Someone is walking out into the light for the first time. They don't know what's out there. They never did. Neither does anyone else. That's where the story goes next. Sleep well. The numbers that don't appear vaults, we're still waiting for. The Fallout franchise has been running for nearly 3 decades, and across that time has added new Vault lore with each major release. But the numbering system it established early on creates a specific kind of anticipation. Every gap in the known vault numbers is a promise. Vault 2, Vault 5, Vault 6, Vault 7, Vault 9, Vault 10, Vault 14, Vault 16, Vault 18, Vault 20, Vault 23, Vault 25, Vault 26, Vault 28, Vault 30, Vault 35. The list of numbers that exist on that heat map on the wall in Vault-Tec's boardroom but have never been assigned a specific story in any published game is long. Each one could be anything. That openness is part of what keeps the franchise's creative space viable. There is always more Vault to explore. Vault 2, for example, appears in a single brief reference in the Fallout universe. It is mentioned in connection with a sports-obsessed overseer. This is the entirety of what the canonical lore has ever said about it. One character note for one administrator of one vault, and the rest is silence. What was the experiment? What did the sports obsession produce in the context of sealed community life? Did the population spend 200 years organized around athletic competition as the primary mode of status and conflict resolution? Did this produce an unusually healthy, physically capable community? Or did it produce the specific pathology that forms when sports culture becomes total? We don't know. The franchise doesn't tell us. The number just sits there, occupied and unexplored. This is one of the things the Vault system does as a narrative structure that most fictional institutions can't do. It has specific numbered entries, it has a known total count, and the gap between the numbers we know and the total we've been given is a space that belongs, narratively, to future storytelling. Every new Fallout game or season of television can open a door that has been numbered but sealed since the beginning of the franchise. The vaults are an inexhaustible story engine. As long as the numbers run, there are more stories to tell. Small moments inside the big machines. Before we fully close this journey through the vaults, there are a handful of smaller details, not full vault stories but individual moments embedded in the larger narratives that deserve specific attention because they demonstrate how the Fallout universe hides its most emotionally precise storytelling in the margins. The coffee mug at the entrance to Vault 11's sacrificial chamber has already been mentioned. It's worth returning to as an example of what environmental storytelling at its best accomplishes. The mug is not explained. There is no journal entry about who left it or why. There is no holotape recording. There is only a coffee mug sitting on the floor near a door that leads to a room where people went to be executed. The presence of the mug implies the presence of a person who was carrying it casually, who stopped at this particular door, who left the mug behind rather than bringing it further. The entire story of one person's final moments, their composure, their resignation, or their courage, the fact that they had been having coffee like a normal person right up until the end, is communicated by the placement of an object. In Vault 92, the violin that belonged to Hilda Egelbrecht is lying in the recording studio where the Vault's musicians worked. It has been there for 200 years. The case is still closed, which suggests it was put away carefully rather than abandoned in a moment of crisis. Someone, at some point, thought to close the violin case. The instrument inside is pristine enough when the lone wanderer finds and delivers it to Agatha to be played. 200 years of dust and silence, and the violin survived to make music again. The Soil Stradivarius is named after a fictional iteration of the Stradivarius family's legendary instruments in the real world that have survived 300 years and still produce music of extraordinary quality. The parallel is intentional. Some things survive catastrophe. In Vault 101, there is a character named Stanley Armstrong who maintains the Vault's equipment. He is, functionally, a minor NPC in the game's opening section, someone the player might talk to a few times during the Vault prologue before leaving and potentially never seeing again. But Armstrong represents something important about what keeps a vault running: the unglamorous, essential, ongoing labor of maintenance. The experimental data the vaults were collecting was dependent on the vaults actually functioning, and the vault's functioning was dependent on people like Stanley Armstrong showing up every day and fixing what broke. Vault Society required its experimenters and its overseers, but it also required its mechanics and its farmers and its doctors. The data was collected by the machines. The conditions that made data collection possible were maintained by ordinary people doing ordinary work. The terminal entry in Vault 111 from the security officer who participated in the mutiny against the Vault director and who later died in the facility reads in part as a document of disillusionment. He didn't sign on to die in a sealed vault. He signed on to protect the people inside and eventually emerge into a rebuilt world. When the resources ran short and the director proved unwilling or unable to manage the crisis, the collapse of authority happened quickly. His record of what transpired is written in the flat, slightly formal language of someone trained in professional documentation, trying to record events that the professional documentation format was not designed to handle. The formality and the content don't match, and the gap between them is where the grief lives. What we leave behind. Every vault is, in the end, a record of what people left behind. The terminal entries, the holotapes, the physical objects arranged in the spaces where people lived and worked and died, all of it is evidence of human presence that the evidence itself cannot fully reconstruct. You can know, from the records, what happened in Vault 11. You can trace the political history, follow the corruption of the election process, identify the key figures, reconstruct the final days. What you cannot recover is what it felt like. The specific quality of the fear when the announcement came that the sacrifice requirement applied. The specific texture of the grief when someone you had grown up with was elected overseer and both of you knew what that meant. The specific weight of the silence after the last sacrifice walked into the chamber and the door closed. The Fallout universe is full of these silences. The records exist. The records are incomplete. The silence between what is documented and what was actually experienced is the space that the player's imagination fills, and the reason the vaults feel real in a way that few fictional locations manage. You bring something to them. You bring your own understanding of what it means to be trapped, to be afraid, to trust an institution that fails you, to belong to a community that becomes something you didn't expect. The vaults meet that understanding and amplify it through the specific, unusual, sometimes absurd, often tragic particulars of what Vault Tech designed. The door is sealed. The experiment is running. Somewhere in the automated systems, data is being recorded about how long you sat here, what you heard, what you felt. Vault Tech thanks you for your participation. Your safety is their #1 priority. Rest easy. The number on your door is 33, or 13, or 101, or 111, or whichever number they gave you when they handed you the jumpsuit and the Pip-Boy and told you everything was going to be fine. They were lying. You probably already knew that. Go to sleep. The world will still be a wasteland when you wake up. Maybe you'll build something in it. That's the whole story. That's all there is. Good night. If you made it all the way through, truly thank you, and I mean that. Hit subscribe if you want more of these long-form lore journeys. Leave a like if this helped you wind down. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I read every single one. See you in the next vault. Appendix: the vault numbers at a glance, a complete reference for listeners. For anyone following along and wanting to keep track of the vaults covered in this script, here is a final walkthrough of each one, with its key experimental mandate and outcome summarized in a few sentences. Think of this as a quiet recap, a way to let the full picture settle as you drift off. Vault 3, Mojave Desert. A control vault. The residents lived peacefully for generations until a water leak forced them to open the door. The fiends subsequently massacred the population and took over the facility. Vault 4, Los Angeles. Scientists were given total authority over a civilian population used as research subjects. The subjects revolted, killed the scientists, and built a genuinely welcoming community from the ruins of what had been done to them. Vault 8, Northwestern Nevada. A true control vault that opened on schedule. The residents used their GECK and founded Vault City, one of the most technologically advanced communities in the post-war West. Vault 11, Mojave Desert. Residents were told to sacrifice one person annually or face collective death. They obeyed for decades before 5 survivors refused. The system congratulated them and opened the door. 4 of the 5 took their own lives. Vault 12, Bakersfield. The door was designed not to close. The population was exposed to radiation from the moment the bombs fell. They ghoulified and founded Necropolis. Vault 13, Southern California. A control vault designed to stay sealed for 200 years. A broken water chip forced the vault dweller out. Their exile by a fearful overseer set the events of the original Fallout game in motion. Vault 15, Southern California. A diverse population was packed together with an intentionally delayed opening. The community fractured into raider gangs and the founders of Shady Sands, eventually becoming the NCR. Vault 17, West Coast. Residents were taken by the Master's super mutant army and processed through FEV. Vault 19, Mojave. Residents were divided into red and blue sectors and subjected to subliminal messaging designed to induce paranoia and mutual distrust. Vault 21, Las Vegas. All disputes were resolved by games of chance. The community held for nearly 200 years until Robert House won ownership of the vault in a blackjack game. Vault 22, Mojave Desert. A team of scientists studied underground agriculture. A fungal pesticide called Bovaria mordicana became airborne, infected and reanimated the population, and created the spore carrier creatures. Vault 24, Mojave. Residents were subjected to brain-computer interface brainwashing designed to turn them into ideological agents. The experiment failed. Most of the population died. Vault 27, deliberately overcrowded with double the standard population. Vault 29, West Coast, populated exclusively with children. A Zax computer raised them under a nature-focused educational program. Diana Stone subverted the experiment through her networked brain. Vault 31, 32, and 33, Los Angeles. An interconnected system. Vault 31 held cryogenically frozen Vault-Tec executives meant to periodically emerge and manage the adjacent communities according to a corporate succession plan. Vault 34, Mojave. An overstocked armory with no security restrictions. Conflict over the weapons eventually produced a reactor leak. Survivors founded the Boomers. Vault 36. Food consisted only of thin, watery gruel. Vault 42. Lighting was restricted to 40-watt bulbs. Vault 51, Appalachia. No human overseer was assigned. A ZAX AI was tasked with selecting the ideal leader by observing and testing the population. ZAX escalated its testing to lethal levels. Vault 53. Equipment was designed to malfunction regularly. Vault 55. No entertainment of any kind. Vault 56. Entertainment consisted exclusively of tapes of a poor-quality comedian. Vault 63, Appalachia. A personal project of Vault-Tec board member Hugo Stolz, designed to develop weather manipulation and large-scale robotics. The unfinished vault ghoulified its population. Vault 68. Population of 999 men and 1 woman. Vault 69. Population of 999 women and 1 man. Vault 70. Jumpsuit manufacturing equipment was designed to break after 6 months. Vault 75. Massachusetts. Children were separated from parents on entry. Parents were executed. Children were raised in a eugenics program, tested and harvested for genetic material at age 18. Vault 76. Appalachia. A genuine control. Vault, housing the best and brightest. Opened on schedule on Reclamation Day, 2102. Vault 77. 1 resident and a crate of puppets. The resident eventually left, armed with the particular violence that 200 years of isolation-induced dissociation had produced. Vault 79, Appalachia. Housed the United States gold reserves under Secret Service protection. Vault 81, Massachusetts. A hidden science division was designed to use the civilian population as medical test subjects. The first overseer sealed off the science division to protect the civilians. Vault 87, Capital Wasteland. Residents were subjected to the forced evolutionary virus. The result was the Capital Wasteland's super mutant population. Vault 88, Massachusetts. A testing facility for prototype productivity equipment never completed before the bombs fell. Vault 92, Maryland. Top musicians were recruited under false pretenses. White noise generators embedded subliminal violent commands. The community destroyed itself. Vault 94, Appalachia. A pacifist religious community. When they emerged and were attacked by paranoid wastelanders, their damaged GECK created the mire. Vault 95, Massachusetts. Chem addicts were rehabilitated, then confronted with a hidden cache of substances. The community collapsed into violence. Vault 96, Appalachia. 5 researchers studied mutated wildlife. Automated security threatened execution for quota failures. The researchers died attempting to escape. Vault 101, Virginia. Never designed to open. The experiment studied how long absolute overseer authority could maintain a closed population. Vault 106, Virginia. Psychoactive drugs were released into the air supply 10 days after sealing. The population went insane. The drugs are still running when the lone wanderer arrives. Vault 108 Virginia, an overseer chosen for his terminal illness. Excessive weapons, a cloning laboratory. The clones were all named Gary. Only Garys remain when the lone wanderer arrives. Vault 111 Massachusetts. Cryogenic suspension of an unsuspecting population. The staff died. The residents slept for 210 years. Vault 112, Virginia. Virtual reality pods. Director Stanislaus Braun used the simulation to torment the residents for 200 years. Vault 114, Massachusetts. Designed to house wealthy Bostonians in deliberately Spartan conditions. Never completed. Vault 118, Maine. Class division experiment. Rich residents would have had power over poor ones. Never completed. That is the complete record. 175 secrets across every vault that has been given a story, every experiment that has been documented, every community that formed and fractured and sometimes, against all probability, survived. The Vault Tech program was built on lies. The communities it produced were, for better and worse, entirely real. They are still out there in the wasteland. They are still living with what the experiments made of them. So are you? In whatever way the things done to you and the communities that shaped you and the institutions you were promised would protect you have left their mark. The parallel between the vault and the world is never accidental in Fallout. It was always the point. Sleep well. The Overseer is not watching. The experiment is over. You can go.